Section 1. The Myth of the Original. Welcome back. Get comfortable. Whether you are in bed right now, settled into that same chair you have spent the past 4 hours in because sleep just would not come no matter what you tried, or you stumbled. Across this video at 2 in the morning with no particular plan other than finding something to settle your brain down, this one is for you. We are going to spend the next couple of hours talking about Family Guy. Not about whether it is good or bad. Not about which episode made you spit your drink. Not about the chicken fights or Brian dying or Stewie's time machine or any of the greatest hits. We are going to talk about something deeper and stranger and more interesting than any of that. Something that almost nobody says out loud, even though the evidence for it has been hiding in plain sight for 25 years. Something that the show's own creator has quietly acknowledged in interviews across decades. Something that The Simpsons literally put into one of its own episodes in the form of a criminal charge written in Italian. Family Guy was never truly original. Now, before you reach for the comments to tell me how wrong I am, let me be precise. Not being original is not the same thing as being bad. It is not an insult. It does not diminish what the show accomplished or the genuine affection hundreds of millions of people have felt for it. Some of the most beloved creative works in all of human history are built on entirely borrowed foundations. Shakespeare, the man we have called the greatest writer in the English language for 400 years, borrowed almost every single one of his major plot lines from earlier. Sources. Romeo and Juliet came from an Italian novella written around 1530. Hamlet was drawn from a Danish legend recorded in historical chronicle centuries before Shakespeare was born. Macbeth came from Scottish historical records. King Lear came from English legends that predate the playwright by hundreds of years. If Shakespeare had credited his sources the way a modern student footnotes a research paper, nearly every play he wrote would need a bibliography attached to it. And yet nobody calls Shakespeare unoriginal. We call him a genius, who understood that the power of storytelling lies not in the novelty of the raw material, but in what you do with it. What specific human truth you can find inside a story that has already been told in rougher form. George Lucas built Star Wars on a skeleton borrowed from the Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, specifically from a 1958 period adventure film called The Hidden Fortress, and dressed that skeleton in the clothing of Joseph Campbell's heroic mythology framework from his 1949 book The Hero with a Thousand Faces. The visual design borrowed from 1930s and 1940s serialized science fiction. The Force has roots in Eastern philosophy going back centuries. The Jedi are samurai. The Empire is Nazi Germany with chrome plating. None of this diminishes Star Wars in the slightest. It remains one of the most emotionally powerful pieces of popular storytelling in the history of cinema. The sources do not cancel the achievement. Bob Dylan took old folk melodies circulating through the oral tradition for generations and put new words and arrangements on top of them. Musicologists have traced specific melodies in some of his most celebrated songs back to 19th century sources. This became briefly controversial and then stopped being controversial because the argument against it collapsed on contact with the music itself. The songs Dylan produced are Dylan's. Working within a tradition is not theft. It is how culture extends itself across time. Originality in the pure, absolute sense. The idea that something arrives in the world carrying no fingerprints from anything that came before. Built entirely from first principles in one person's mind in complete isolation is essentially a myth. It does not describe how creativity actually works. What actually happens is that a person deeply immersed in a tradition reaches the point where they can see it clearly enough to contribute something that was not there before. The contribution is real. The tradition it enters is older and larger and full of contributions that shape the person who made this new one. Both things are true simultaneously. But Family Guy is a special case. The reason it requires careful examination is the gap between how original the show presented itself to be and how deeply, structurally borrowed its actual creative DNA turned out to be when examined honestly. This is not a gap of style or tone. It goes all the way down to the characters themselves, the comedy format that defines the show more than anything else, and most remarkably to work that Seth MacFarlane himself had already produced 4 years before the show ever aired. The show's most original seeming elements were, in the most literal possible sense, already made. By the same person. In a college dorm room in Rhode Island in 1995. When Family Guy premiered in January 1999, the cultural positioning was clear. Here was a fresh new voice. Here was something different, and in certain narrow senses that framing contained truth. There were things Family Guy did in that particular combination, with that particular energy, in that particular prime-time network context that had not been done in quite that form before. The gestalt of the thing felt new. But the component parts were not new. Not a single structural element of the show was genuinely new. The family format was not new. The overweight, working-class, well-meaning but incompetent father was not new. The patient, more competent wife was not new. The 3 children configuration was not new. The small fictional American town was not new. The local bar as male social hub was not new. The cutaway gag format was not new. The talking animal character providing intelligent outsider commentary was not new. Even the specific characters at the show's core, Peter and Brian, were not new in the most important sense, because Seth MacFarlane had already made them 4 years earlier in a short film that almost nobody had seen. That is the story we are going to tell tonight, long and carefully, moving through every layer. From the college thesis film in 1995 that was already essentially Family Guy, through the Simpsons template borrowed so systematically that The Simpsons made it a joke in 2 different episodes, through the lineage of the dysfunctional American family going back to the 1950s, through the cutaway gag format and who actually invented it, through the character archetypes and what was genuinely original within them, and finally toward the only question that matters. Whether any of this matters, and if so, exactly how and why. The answer is more interesting and more useful than a simple yes or no. It involves a specific theory about how borrowed creative foundations behave over time, why some shows built on borrowed elements sustain their quality across long runs while others collapse under the weight of the borrowing, and why Family Guy's specific creative decline was not an accident or an inevitability, but a direct consequence of the gap between what it claimed to be and what it actually was underneath. A companion show, created by the same person, on the same network, dismissed as a lesser imitation, handed to other people and largely ignored by the man who started it, would end up demonstrating by quietly getting better every season that Family Guy's problems were choices, not inevitabilities. That show is American Dad, and its existence is the single most powerful piece of evidence in the entire argument. But first things first. Get comfortable. The room is quiet. There is nowhere you need to be. We are going to move through this slowly. Before we go further, drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I mean it. Reading those comment sections is genuinely one of my favorite parts of making these long videos. There is something moving about knowing someone in Christchurch or Kampala or Edmonton or Reykjavik is lying in the dark with these same words as someone in a suburb of Phoenix or a flat in Manchester. These comment sections become strange, beautiful maps of the world at late night and early morning. If you want more of these, hit subscribe while you are down there. It costs nothing and it helps more than you realize. Section 2. The Larry Shorts, when MacFarlane copied himself first. The year is 1995. Seth MacFarlane is 21 years old and enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. He has a thesis film to complete. Not optional. Not extra credit. The central deliverable of his undergraduate education, the work that is supposed to demonstrate everything he has learned. He works largely alone, with minimal help from a couple of classmates who help film a brief live-action wraparound segment. He draws by hand. He voices the characters. He writes the script. He is doing, in miniature and with essentially no budget, exactly what he will do 3 years later with Fox's money and Fox's time slot and Fox's audience, building an animated show from scratch, sustained by creative enthusiasm and a specific sense of humor that he has been developing for years. The film he produces is called The Life of Larry. What makes The Life of Larry extraordinary is not its production quality, which is rough, not its runtime, which is short, not its budget, which was essentially nothing. What makes it extraordinary is that it is already Family Guy, not in rough sketch or vague thematic suggestion, in specific, fully realized detail. The characters are there, the comedic format is there, the rhythm of the jokes is there, the dynamic between the two leads is there, fully formed, already natural, already funny. Many of the actual gags, specific punchlines with specific setups and specific timing, are already present in this 1995 college film. 4 years before Family Guy premiered in front of tens of millions of Super Bowl viewers, Seth MacFarlane had already made the show. He made it in his undergraduate years, and when Fox asked him to make it again with $50,000 in a prime time slot, he obliged. The main character of The Life of Larry is a man named Larry. He is heavyset. He is warm-hearted in that specific way that makes someone simultaneously lovable and exhausting, genuinely meaning well, while consistently failing to think anything through, before committing to it with full confidence. His intelligence exists primarily as cheerful certainty that he is right about things, a certainty almost entirely disconnected from whether he is actually right. He has a life. He has friends. He has a home. Everything about his existence is ordinary in texture, even when it keeps going sideways, because of his persistent inability to anticipate consequences before they arrive. He has a talking dog named Steve. Steve is, without ambiguity, smarter than every human character in the film. He provides dry, patient, occasionally exasperated commentary on whatever disaster Larry has most recently stumbled into. He is essentially a fully realized human intelligence occupying a dog's body, and the comedy of his existence comes entirely from the gap between what he is on the inside, the most perceptive, most reasonable mind in the household, and what he appears to be from the outside, which is a family pet. He has opinions about culture. He drinks. He has an inner life more developed and more honest than anything the humans around him manage. These two characters are Peter and Brian Griffin. Not approximately. Not as loose thematic parallels. They are Peter and Brian Griffin given different names, drawn in a rougher style in a shorter format. If you watched The Life of Larry without knowing its history and someone asked you what show these characters eventually became, you would arrive at the correct answer in about 30 seconds. MacFarlane followed this film with a second short in 1996 titled Larry and Steve, produced for Cartoon Network's world premiere Toons programming block, the same showcase that helped launch Dexter's Laboratory and Cow and Chicken. This premiered in 1997. The concept is identical. Larry is still the stumbling, good-hearted chaos generator. Steve is still the intelligent, suffering witness. Their relationship is fully formed and completely natural, and evidently beloved to MacFarlane because he has been working with it for 2 years and is still finding it funny and still finding it worth refining. The dynamic has the ease of something that has been practiced. Now here is the detail that deserves the most careful attention. MacFarlane did not simply draw thematic inspiration from his college films. He took the jokes themselves. The actual gags with their specific setups and specific delivery rhythms. Multiple cutaway jokes from the life of Larry appeared in the first season of Family Guy, not as variations or callbacks, but as near-direct reproductions. A bit about England having a culture of drive-by arguments, people shouting insults at each other in passing, appeared in the Family Guy episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang, a flatulence flashback sequence built on an identical comedic rhythm and structure, appeared in Death Has a Shadow, the very first episode of Family Guy to air on national television. A Star Trek parody from the Larry short appeared in I Never Met the Dead Man. These are not the vague overlaps you chalk up to an artist returning to familiar territory. These are the same jokes rebuilt for a bigger stage. The millions of people who watched Family Guy's premiere in January 1999 were laughing at material that had already been produced in a college dorm room 4 years earlier. The college thesis had been reformatted as national broadcast content. Fox's role in this needs to be stated plainly. When they contracted MacFarlane in 1997 and 1998, they were not asking him to pitch something new. They had seen Larry and Steve. The deal was specifically to take those characters and expand them into a full primetime animated series. This is documented. This is the official origin of the show. Peter Griffin is Larry with a new name and 4 years of refinement. Brian Griffin is Steve with a more developed interior life and a fondness for dry martinis. The family, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, was the addition requested to make the premise fit the family comedy format the network needed. But the core comedic engine, the specific dyad of the stumbling, lovable man and his intelligent, weary companion, was already there. Already made. Already tested. What MacFarlane genuinely added in the transition from the Larry films to Family Guy is important and real and deserves honest acknowledgement. Stewie Griffin has no equivalent in the Larry shorts. He is a genuine original invention that arrived during the development process, one of the most original character concepts in the history of the form. We will give him the full space he deserves in a later section. Brian's specific interiority, the failed writer, the drinking as character flaw rather than comedy prop, the buried romantic feeling, the New England intellectual aspiration is more developed and more genuinely human than anything in the shorts. The cultural specificity of the New England setting gives Peter a regional identity that Larry never had. But the foundation was not new. The foundation was Seth MacFarlane's own earlier work, reformatted for a bigger stage and dressed in new clothes. This is not dishonest. It is how careers develop. Artists return to the same material, refine it, find the larger version of something they began thinking about in a smaller context. This is legitimate, but it is a different story from the one told about Family Guy when it premiered. The story of a fresh new voice arriving with something the medium had not seen before. The voice was not fresh. The material was third generation. What was new was the platform and the budget and the scale of the audience. There is a quality to the early Family Guy that this history explains. The first 3 seasons feel confident in a way that debut work rarely does. The characters know who they are. The comedy knows what it is doing. The show does not feel like it is figuring itself out, because it had already figured itself out privately across years of iteration before the audience arrived. The polish was applied before the broadcast. That confidence came from MacFarlane having worked with these characters and these comedy premises for 3 years before Fox gave them a time slot. By the time the pilot aired, he had been refining this specific material since college. The early seasons feel right, because someone who understood them completely was making them. Understanding this also begins to explain the later decline. When MacFarlane stepped back from the day-to-day creative work and the writing room changed, the borrowed elements underneath the genuine work became more visible because they were no longer being actively sustained by the specific genuine creative investment that had originally justified them. The confidence of the early seasons was not transferable. It belonged to the person who had earned it through years of private iteration. When that person withdrew, the borrowed skeleton underneath the genuine flesh was gradually exposed. Section 3. The Simpsons Blueprint. What Family Guy borrowed room by room. Now we get to the comparison that cannot be avoided. The one that even The Simpsons addressed multiple times on screen in jokes carrying more honest content than they do pure comedy. The comparison that critics noted the moment the first Family Guy episode aired in January 1999 and that has never fully dissolved in the quarter century since. Family Guy borrowed extensively and structurally from The Simpsons. This is not a fringe position. It is a structural fact acknowledged by people on both sides of the comparison, documented in the critical record from 1999 onward, and addressed directly by both shows in their own scripts. When the show you allegedly borrowed from puts a picture of your main character in a book of criminals under the Italian word for plagiarism, as The Simpsons did in a 2005 episode, you are past the point where the comparison can be waved away. That moment is the show making an accusation it knew would be recognized as accurate, embedding it in comedy so that the accuracy could be acknowledged without requiring a formal admission. It is clever, and it is honest, and it is the clearest single piece of evidence in the record. Start at the structural level, because this is where the borrowing is most complete and most visible. Both shows center on a nuclear family in a small, fictional American city. Both fathers are overweight, blue-collar workers who are not particularly intelligent in the ways that everyday social navigation demands. Both love beer with a devotion that is simultaneously comic and character-defining. Both hold working-class jobs that support their families without conferring social prestige. Both spend significant time at a local bar with male friends who share their general temperament and consistently encourage their worst impulses. Both love their families in a genuine and demonstrable way that coexists uneasily with their persistent failure to demonstrate it through their actions. Homer Simpson works at the Springfield nuclear power plant, in a job he barely understands and retains through institutional inertia. Peter Griffin works at a toy factory and later at a beer brewery. Both are working-class jobs communicating the same thing about the men who hold them. They are not climbing any ladder. They have made peace with the life they have even on the days when they have not quite made that peace. And they represent a specific kind of American working man that both shows were built to portray. Homer drinks at Moe's Tavern with Lenny, Carl, and Barney. Peter drinks at the Drunken Clam with Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland. Both bars serve structurally identical narrative functions. They are the places where the main character escapes domestic responsibility and finds his worst impulses encouraged by companions who share those impulses. Both are settings where many episodes begin, where trouble is instigated, where schemes are hatched that the following 22 minutes will follow to their inevitable conclusions. Both towns share the same supporting character ecosystem. A news anchor who appears when the plot requires mass communication, a doctor whose incompetence is of a recurring comic variety, a wealthy local antagonist whose power occasionally threatens the main family, a religious leader whose sincerity generates comedy, a police department more comic than functional. Both generate supporting characters who become recurring presences without becoming fully central. Both operate on the same mechanical logic, a community large enough to produce rotating story material, but small enough that everyone's paths cross constantly. The mothers are structurally near identical. Marge Simpson and Lois Griffin are both housewives carrying the domestic weight of the family. Both have implied backstories suggesting more interesting personal histories before marriage narrowed the field. Both exercise more patience with their husbands than any outside observer would recommend. Both are more competent and more self-aware than their husbands, and both love those husbands anyway with a quality of choice that both shows treat as evidence of genuine depth, rather than poor judgment. The three children configuration parallels with precision. Both shows have a teenage daughter in the most emotionally grounded position, receiving less comedic spotlight because of that groundedness. Both have a goofy younger male child without strong intellectual resources. And the baby, this is where the shows most dramatically diverge, and where Family Guy's genuine claim to originality is strongest. Maggie Simpson is silent, observational, primarily background. She is the baby as decorative family element. Stewie Griffin is an evil genius baby plotting world domination and the murder of his mother. This specific departure is a genuine original invention with no Springfield equivalent, and we will give it the full attention it deserves. The 2014 crossover special is the most explicit single acknowledgement of the relationship between the shows. Its central plot involves a lawsuit establishing that Pawtucket Patriot Ale, the beer Peter's brewery produces, the beer that is part of his identity, is an unauthorized copy of Duff beer with a different label. The show inserted a confession into its own script, wrapped it in comedy, and presented it as both joke and admission simultaneously. When Peter Griffin in that episode acknowledges that the show borrowed a lot from The Simpsons, it is a guilty plea dressed as a punchline. The dress does not change what the plea is. Al Jean, longtime Simpsons showrunner, has spoken about the comparison in interviews across the years with measured diplomatic frustration. The frustration was never about the general fact of influence. The Simpsons was shaped by earlier traditions as well, but about the systematic scale of the borrowing and the way Family Guy's cultural success sometimes obscured how much of its foundation was borrowed from the show that came before it. What did Family Guy genuinely add to The Simpsons template? Real things. And they deserve honest acknowledgement. Stewie is genuinely original and has no Springfield equivalent. Brian's specific interiority, the failed writing ambition, the drinking as honest character flaw, the buried romantic longing, the New England intellectual aspiration, is meaningfully different from anything The Simpsons built with its adult characters. The cutaway gag format was deployed at a scale and with a viral efficiency The Simpsons never attempted. The specific New England cultural texture gives Peter a regional specificity Homer's deliberately generic Midwestern everyman never needed. These are genuine additions, two meaningfully original characters, specific regional cultural texture, and a borrowed comedic format deployed at unprecedented scale. That is what Family Guy built on top of The Simpsons foundation. And the tragedy of the show's history is that both genuinely original characters were systematically dismantled by the creative decisions of the later seasons. Early Stewie was retired. Early Brian's specific interior honesty was replaced by familiar pretentiousness. When both genuine additions were gone, what remained was the borrowed template alone. And a borrowed template alone is not enough to sustain a show across 25 seasons. It needs ongoing, genuine investment. The investment stopped coming. Section 4. The Griffin Family versus every animated family before them. To fully understand how deep the roots of Family Guy's structural setup go, you need to trace the lineage of the dysfunctional animated American family all the way back to its actual starting point, not The Simpsons in 1989. Before that, before Married with Children in 1987, all the way back to the black and white television of the early 1950s, where the cultural template was first being built in a medium still figuring out what it could do and say. The television families of the 1950s were aspirational fictions, specifically and deliberately constructed to be aspirational. Leave It to Beaver premiered in 1957. Father Knows Best ran from 1954 to 1960. The Donna Reed Show from 1958 to 1966. These shows built a version of American domestic life that was clean, orderly, and fundamentally free of genuine conflict. The father was wise, patient, and present. The mother was gracious and domestically fulfilled. The children were mischievous in endearing ways that resolved cleanly within the allotted half hour. Problems dissolved through gentle conversation, values transmitted through example. Nobody was overweight. Nobody drank too much. Nobody made a mistake that did not get corrected before the credits rolled. These shows were not honest portraits of American family life in the 1950s. They were comfort objects for an audience that had survived the Great Depression and a World War and was grateful, deeply and genuinely grateful, for narratives about normalcy. And safety. Television as a medium was new. The audience was learning what it could do, and what it appeared to be doing in those early years was confirming that the American dream was real and attainable and worth having. Norman Lear changed this in 1971, and the change was permanent. All in the Family premiered on CBS on January 12th of that year and did something to the American sitcom family that could not be undone. Archie Bunker was not wise. He was bigoted, loud, wrong about most things he was most confident about, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of self-examination that might allow him to know this. His wife Edith was kind but complicated, not simply gracious. His daughter Gloria was political and confrontational in ways television daughters had not been allowed to be. His son-in-law Mike was the ideological counterweight to everything Archie represented, and their dinner table was a genuine battlefield where the social conflicts of early 1970s America played out in family arguments that millions of viewers recognized because they were living versions of those arguments every night at their own tables. Archie Bunker is the genuine ancestor of every lovably wrong American television father who followed him. Homer Simpson owes him a specific and direct debt. Peter Griffin owes him a debt twice removed, once through Homer and once through the broader tradition that Archie established. The template of the man who is wrong about things but not irredeemably evil, who loves his family in ways that barely compensate for the damage he regularly does to them, who holds opinions the show treats as both genuinely felt and genuinely misguided. This is a Norman Lear invention from 1971 that has been passed through the decades, growing more specific in each new version. The Flintstones, premiering in September 1960, is the animated entry in this lineage that most directly precedes Family Guy's specific form and deserves more careful attention than it usually receives in this conversation. The Flintstones was not primarily a children's cartoon. It was a primetime network program airing at 8:30 on Friday nights on ABC, designed for and marketed to adult audiences. It was an animated situation comedy about a nuclear family with an overweight blue-collar father named Fred who worked at a quarry, loved bowling, spent time at a local club with his best friend Barney, had schemes that consistently fell apart, loved his patient wife Wilma more than he ever quite managed to express properly, and regularly found himself in over his head because he committed to things before thinking them through. Replace the Stone Age setting with a brewery and a fictional Rhode Island town, and you have Peter Griffin. The Flintstones was itself explicitly modeled on The Honeymooners, the 1955 CBS sitcom starring Jackie Gleason as Ralph Cramden, a bus driver in New York with large ambitions and insufficient resources for realizing them, a patient and sharper wife named Alice, and a best friend named Ed Norton who enabled his worst impulses. Ralph Cramden is the original. Every subsequent version of the overweight, well-meaning, frequently wrong American sitcom father descends from him whether the creators knew it or not. Fred Flintstone is Ralph Cramden in the Stone Age. Homer Simpson is Ralph Cramden in Springfield, with 30 years of brilliant writing room development applied to the concept. Peter Griffin is Ralph Cramden after both translations had already been done, borrowed from the Simpsons version. Married with Children, premiering on Fox in 1987, the same network that would later air Family Guy, is the link in the chain closest to Family Guy in tone and requires specific attention because the direction the show took in its later seasons, when Peter evolved from lovable fool toward genuine cruelty, was a drift toward the Married with Children end of this tradition. Al Bundy is a shoe salesman who has fully accepted the distance between what he wanted his life to be and what it is. He is not lovable in the warm way Homer is lovable. He is defeated, sardonic, a man who responds to the gap between aspiration and reality with a specific dark resignation. What Married with Children contributed to the tradition was the willingness to strip away the warmth and the redemption arc and see what the comedy looked like in their absence. The answer was still comedy, but colder, meaner, finding laughs in suffering without the compensating warmth that makes suffering and comedy feel human rather than just cruel. Family Guy's later seasons drifted toward this colder end of the tradition. Not because the writers consciously decided to remake Married with Children, but because cruelty and nihilism are available defaults when warmth has been removed from a character, and nothing genuine put in its place. When the warm Peter who apologized and meant it was stripped away by escalating comedic demands, what remained was something much closer to Al Bundy than to the Peter Griffin of the early seasons. Roseanne, running from 1988 to 1997, is the template most directly responsible for the specific emotional warmth of early Family Guy, and is deeply under-acknowledged in discussions of the show's influences. The Connor family were working class in a way that felt specifically observed rather than generically convenient. Dan Connor maintained dignity under genuine economic pressure. Roseanne was sharp and visibly tired and genuinely funny in ways that coexisted honestly with her love for her family and children. The early Family Guy had this quality: the sense that the Griffins were experiencing real pressures and finding comedy in their relationship to those pressures rather than simply being comedy props arranged in a family configuration for the writer's convenience. When Family Guy lost this warmth in the later seasons, it was not simply losing a tone. It was losing its most important connection to the Roseanne tradition of honest working-class family comedy. The tradition that had made the early show feel like it was about real people rather than funny templates. The borrowed structural framework remained. The genuine human warmth that had been layered over it was gone. All of this genealogy locates Family Guy honestly within a 50-year tradition rather than floating above it as something new. The show was not a sudden eruption. It was the newest entry in a long and distinguished line of dysfunctional animated American families, adding specific and real things to what it inherited. The additions were genuine contributions, but the structure it added them to was ancient, well-traveled, and already inhabited by decades of memorable characters and stories. Family Guy moved into a neighborhood that had been developed for generations. Section 5. Cutaway gags. Who actually invented the format? The cutaway gag is Family Guy's signature. More than any character or storyline, it is the thing most associated with the show in the cultural imagination. When people imitate Family Guy, they do the cutaway. When people explain it to someone who has not seen it, they describe the cutaway. When critics attack the writing, they are usually attacking the cutaway. When defenders celebrate the humor, they are usually celebrating the cutaway. It is the mechanism, the fundamental unit, the engine. And it was not invented by Family Guy. The tradition of interrupting a main narrative to insert a brief, disconnected comic sequence is older than television itself. At its deepest roots, it lives in the vaudeville variety show format that dominated American entertainment from the 1880s through the 1930s. Vaudeville presented sequences of completely unconnected acts. A comedian, a juggler, a song, a trained animal act, a magic performance, with no shared narrative, no thematic connection, no obligation for any act to relate to any other. The entertainment was purely in the accumulation of individual moments. Each act was complete in itself. The audience did not need the acts to connect. They needed each act to be good enough to justify waiting for the next one. This structural logic, entertainment as accumulation of individual moments rather than as sustained narrative, is the deep ancestor of the Family Guy episode. Not as direct influence, but as a persistent cultural template for a kind of entertainment that has coexisted with narrative entertainment throughout the entire history of mass. Media. The variety show and the sitcom represent two different answers to the question of what entertainment is for. Family Guy tried to be both simultaneously, and the tension between those two forms generated both the specific energy of its best moments and the specific failure of its weakest ones. In the television era specifically, the most important precursor to the Family Guy cutaway format is Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, which ran on NBC from 1968 to 1973. Laugh-In took the variety format and applied to it the editing language of cinema, fast cuts, rapid transitions, scenes that began and ended before their setups had resolved, jokes that arrived and departed before the audience had fully processed them. The show was kinetic in ways American television had not been before it. Watch it today and it still moves fast. The jokes accumulate quickly, layer on layer, with minimal connective tissue between them. What Laugh-In established was the idea that a half hour of television could be structured as a series of discrete, disconnected joke units strung together by momentum and energy, rather than by story logic. This is Family Guy's structural template, enacted in 1968, 30 years before Family Guy existed. But the most direct creative predecessor to the specific form of the Family Guy cutaway is Monty Python's Flying Circus. This is the comparison that matters most, and the influence runs deeper than structure. Monty Python's Flying Circus premiered on the BBC on October 5, 1969, and ran for 4 series through 1974. Over those 4 series, Graham Chapman, John Cleese, Terry Gilliam, Eric Idle, Terry Jones, and Michael Palin systematically violated the established grammar of television sketch. Comedy with a precision and commitment that permanently changed what the form could do. Previous sketch comedy operated on the assumption that a sketch began, developed, and resolved, that it had a shape with a beginning, a middle, and an end, even if that end was absurdist or unexpected. Monty Python introduced sketches that simply did not end. Characters in the middle of a situation would suddenly find themselves in a completely different situation with no explanation, no transition, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. Terry Gilliam's cut-paper animated sequences would interrupt live-action sketches, deliver a brief, absurdist visual joke, and deposit the narrative somewhere entirely different. The original situation simply abandoned without ceremony. This is the structural template of the Family Guy cutaway gag. A character is in the middle of something. A setup line creates the occasion. The narrative is interrupted by a disconnected comedic sequence with no logical connection to what it interrupts. The sequence concludes. The main story resumes approximately where it left off, as if the interruption did not happen. Monty Python was doing this in 1969. Family Guy deployed it at unprecedented scale 30 years later. The specific technical mechanism is identical. The Python influence extends well beyond structural format into the specific tonal register of Family Guy's best comedy. The approach of deploying elevated, sophisticated language in the service of completely ridiculous content. Characters who treat absurd situations with total seriousness. Whose comedy depends entirely on the gap between the grandeur of the delivery and the silliness of the subject. This runs through Family Guy's best cutaway gags in ways that are unmistakably Pythonic. When a character says this is worse than the time and the show cuts to complete absurdity played entirely without irony, that is a Python technique translated into American animated form. The joke is not look at this ridiculous thing. The joke is look at this ridiculous thing being treated with absolute seriousness. Python established that register in 1969. McFarlane borrowed it and deployed it brilliantly. McFarlane cited Python explicitly and repeatedly as a formative influence. Stewie Griffin's refined British accent, his elevated vocabulary, his grand pronouncements about trivial matters, his absolute commitment to the theatrical presentation of his own malevolence, all Pythonic, all borrowed, all executed with genuine skill. The debt is real and visible, and not diminished by being real. The Simpsons also drew from Python and from the variety show tradition, but deployed the borrowed tools with a restraint that reflected a deliberate creative philosophy. The couch gag that opens every Simpsons episode is the cutaway format placed in a specific ritual space, used once per episode, contained within clear structural boundaries. The Simpsons understood that this tool was powerful enough to require containment, that unlimited deployment would consume the narrative coherence that made the characters matter to viewers. The couch gag is the show acknowledging the technique and then putting it in a box for the duration of the episode. Family Guy removed those boundaries entirely and deployed the technique at a scale that transformed its function. In the early seasons, with genuine creative energy sustaining the execution, this produced brilliant comedy. In the later seasons, the cutaways became longer, more frequent, and more clearly substitutive, replacing story rather than supplementing it, filling time rather than earning it, generating individual moments that were sometimes funny in isolation but hollowed out the characters and stories that make individual funny moments worth caring about. In 2006, Trey Parker and Matt Stone addressed this in their South Park two-parter Cartoon Wars, depicting Family Guy's writing process as manatees selecting random idea balls from a tank and assembling them into joke formulas. The point: the cutaways were interchangeable because the format required no specific connection to the characters or story around it. McFarlane agreed in a 2012 Rolling Stone interview that the critique was accurate. Writers on The Simpsons and King of the Hill reportedly sent appreciative messages to Parker and Stone after those episodes aired. There was, as Parker described it, an animation solidarity moment, collective recognition that something true had been said. The borrowed tool outlasted the context that had made it valuable. That is the specific form of the failure the cutaway history represents, a technique taken from brilliant predecessors, used brilliantly in the early seasons when genuine, creative energy sustained its best applications, and then maintained through inertia long after that genuine energy had been redirected elsewhere. Section 6. Peter Griffin and the Long Shadow of Homer Simpson. Peter Griffin in the early seasons is a character assembled from several visible layers of borrowing. Each layer, worth naming carefully. At the bottom is the great American television father archetype, Ralph Cramden in 1955, Fred Flintstone in 1960, Archie Bunker in 1971, Al Bundy in 1987, the overweight, working class, well-meaning but persistently wrong man whose love for his family is genuine and consistently insufficient. The man who makes the same mistakes not because the writers are lazy, but because those mistakes are constitutive of who he is. Because the mistakes define him as much as anything else does. This archetype predates Family Guy by 50 years, and Family Guy did not significantly modify it at the structural level. On top of that foundation sits the more specific layer of Homer Simpson in particular. What Peter shares with Homer that goes beyond the broader archetype is the precise calibration of functional incompetence. Homer is not so limited that he cannot hold a job or raise 3 children to some form of adulthood, but he is limited enough that almost everything he takes initiative on generates more problems than it solves. This calibration is specific and deliberate, stupid enough to be consistently funny across long seasons, competent enough to remain credibly functional in a show's world. Peter's incompetence is calibrated identically. Both characters operate in the same narrow band, and that band was designed for Homer first. Both characters have identical social worlds organized identically. Homer at Moe's with Lenny, Carl, and Barney. Peter at the Drunken Clam with Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland. Both groups serve the same narrative function. Both towns have equivalent supporting characters performing equivalent structural roles. Ken Tucker, reviewing the show for Entertainment Weekly in 1999, called Peter Homer Simpson as conceived by a singularly sophomoric mind that lacks any reference point beyond other TV shows. MacFarlane has never directly disputed this. The 2014 crossover special has Peter himself acknowledge the borrowing in a scene simultaneously functioning as confession and comedy. The dual function is itself revealing. When your most honest creative self-assessment has to be a joke to be expressible, you are acknowledging something you do not want to say straight out. But Peter Griffin genuinely adds things to the borrowed Homer template, and these additions deserve honest acknowledgement. The voice is specifically Peter's, based on a real person MacFarlane overheard at RISD, developed with choices that Homer's vocal performance never involved. It carries a specific New England working-class Irish Catholic cadence and the particular cheerful wrong-headedness of a certain kind of man from that part of the country. This is not Homer's voice. It communicates something specific about this version of the type that Homer's voice communicates differently. The New England cultural identity is real and specifically observed. Peter's relationship to regional sports, the Patriots, the Red Sox, to the Irish Catholic community structure, to the specific class dynamics of working-class Rhode Island, gives him a texture that Homer's deliberately generic Midwestern everyman never attempted. Springfield is explicitly located nowhere as a joke. The Griffin family's town is explicitly in New England, and the specificity of that placement generates comedy grounded in real cultural knowledge. In the early seasons, Peter also has a warmth calibrated differently from Homer's. The early Griffin family warmth was genuine and earned through specific moments, hugs at the end of difficult episodes, instinctive protectiveness toward his kids that surprised. By being sincere, the sense that this chaotic family loved each other underneath the chaos. This is the quality that made the early show feel human rather than just funny, and it is precisely what was stripped away in the later seasons as the show pushed Peter toward cruelty in search of escalating comedic effect. The season 10 episode where Meg confronts her family is the show holding a mirror up to what Peter had become. Everything Meg says is accurate. He is completely selfish, completely irresponsible, abusive without consequence or recognition. The early Peter would have been hurt by those words. He would have felt something genuine. The later Peter laughs. The feeling was gone. What remained was the borrowed archetype without the specific genuine qualities that had made the early Peter more than just another version of that archetype. A borrowed character exposed without the flesh that had once covered the borrowed bones. Section 7. Brian Griffin and the Talking Animal Tradition. Brian Griffin is the character defenders of Family Guy's originality invoke most often, and they have good reason. Early Brian is genuinely one of the most specifically realized and emotionally honest characters in adult animated television. The specific combination of his qualities represents a real creative achievement. But the tradition he belongs to is old and well-populated, and understanding it deepens appreciation of what Brian genuinely adds and sharpens understanding of why the later. Brian's collapse into a familiar type was so specifically damaging. The talking animal as vehicle for social commentary is one of the oldest storytelling tools in the human repertoire. Aesop's fables, circulating in written form from at least the 6th century before the Common Era, used animals who speak and reason as their primary means of illuminating human behavior. The tradition of the intelligent animal who observes human foolishness from a position of superior clarity and finds the observation both enlightening and exhausting is 2,500 years old before Brian Griffin ever poured his first martini. In American television specifically, the lineage is traceable and specific. Mr. Ed ran on CBS from 1961 to 1966, featuring a talking horse who spoke only to his owner Wilbur Post and kept the communication secret from everyone else. The one-sided arrangement generated comedy of dramatic irony, the audience knowing something the characters do not, and a structural dynamic that Family Guy's early Stewie. Format borrowed more directly than its Brian format, but the premise of the intelligent animal embedded in a human household and providing commentary on the humans around him is visible here. Alf, running on NBC from 1986 to 1990, is the most direct television predecessor. An extraterrestrial named Gordon Shumway lived with the Tanner family in suburban California and spent 4 seasons providing sardonic commentary on human culture from the position of an intelligent outsider who found almost everything about human society baffling and disappointing. He was opinionated, self-interested, occasionally kind, and fully a person in every functional sense. Brian Griffin is Alf filtered through adult animation and given a richer, more specifically human interior life, the same concept of the non-human intelligence embedded in a suburban family, stripped of the family comedy, staging, and given genuine psychological depth. What Brian genuinely adds to the tradition is that depth, and it is the specific combination of qualities that makes early Brian a genuine creative contribution. We know he wants to be a serious writer and that this aspiration is connected to something real. Years of failed attempts. A manuscript he cannot complete. The specific painful gap between what he believes himself capable of and what he has actually produced. This is not borrowed. It belongs to Brian. We know he drinks too much, and that the drinking is an honest symptom of something real. Loneliness. The gap between aspiration and reality. The specific discomfort of being the most perceptive person in rooms full of people who find his perceptions unnecessary. We know he carries buried romantic feelings for Lois that surface in specific moments handled with care and restraint. We know he is insecure about his intelligence despite being genuinely intelligent, that his confidence is partially performed. These specific qualities in their specific combination are where the genuine creative contribution lives. The tragedy of Brian is the loss of these specific genuine qualities across the later seasons. The failed writer who cares about his failure became the pretentious fraud who deploys failure as a rationale for arrogance. The loyal friend became the man who in one episode finds a woman trapped in a car about to fall into the ocean, begins to rescue her, discovers she has a child and is therefore married, and lets go of the car, letting an innocent woman and her child drown because she was unavailable for him to date. The genuine loneliness was replaced by performed superiority. The specific human truth was removed and a familiar, unflattering type inserted in its place. The Quagmire speech from Season 8, where Glenn Quagmire tells Brian exactly why he despises him, is the show's most honest moment of self-critique. Everything Quagmire says is accurate and verifiable by specific examples from the show's own episodes. Brian is a phony. His intellectual pretensions are backed by no genuine accomplishment. He pursues Lois in ways that betray Peter's friendship. He abandoned his own son. The show knew what Brian had become, assembled the evidence into a devastating speech, delivered it, and then continued producing the exact thing the speech described. This is not ignorance. Knowing what you are doing wrong and continuing to do it is a choice. Section 8. Stewie Griffin and the Evil Genius Archetype. Stewie Griffin is the trump card. When someone wants to argue that Family Guy brought something genuinely new to television, something irreplaceable, something that had not existed before, they lead with Stewie. And they are right to do so. Early Stewie, the Stewie of the first 3 seasons before the writers decided to retire the evil genius concept, is one of the most originally conceived characters in the history of primetime animated television. That originality is real and complete and deserves full acknowledgement. But Stewie does not arrive from nowhere. He is built from a tradition. Understanding that tradition deepens appreciation of what he genuinely adds to it. The Bond villain is the most immediately recognizable ancestor. From Dr. No in 1962 through every subsequent film in the franchise across more than 60 years, the international supervillain has been one of the most recognizable and most imitated figures in popular entertainment. These characters share specific defining qualities: extraordinary intelligence combined with megalomaniacal ambition, an aestheticized relationship to cruelty, a fondness for elaborate self-explanation, and an absolute conviction that their superiority over other people is so obvious it barely requires demonstration. They speak in elevated, precise language. Their plans are over-engineered as exhibitions of their own capability. They are dangerous and frightening and always, in their specific way, inherently comic. Because the gap between the grandeur of their self-presentation and the ultimate failure of their projects is a structural joke baked into the character type from the very beginning. Saturday morning cartoon villainy adds a second layer of ancestry that is equally important. Cobra Commander, Skeletor, Mum-Ra, Dr. Claw, the antagonists of 1980s American children's animation, were melodramatic and wholly committed to wickedness in ways that made them funny even when nominally threatening. They made speeches to inattentive subordinates. Their plans were elaborate and ultimately foiled. They returned unchanged the following week to begin another plan with no acknowledgement of previous failure. McFarlane grew up with these characters, absorbed their conventions, and used them as building material for something genuinely new. What Stewie does with these borrowed ancestors is a structural operation of genuine creative brilliance. He places both the Bond villain and the Saturday morning cartoon villain inside a body that is constitutively incapable of containing them. A 1-year-old baby in a yellow shirt and red overalls, sitting in a high chair, eating strained peas, calmly discussing his plans for world domination in the same breath as requesting his bottle. The gap between the form and the content is the fundamental joke of the character, and it is a gap that can never close. The form is an infant, the content is a supervillain. These two things are irreconcilable. Every attempt to reconcile them is the comedy, and the comedy never runs out in the early seasons because the writing keeps finding new angles on the same fundamental. Irreconcilability. MacFarlane modeled Stewie's voice explicitly on Rex Harrison, specifically on Harrison's performance as Henry Higgins in the 1964 film adaptation of My Fair Lady. Rex Harrison in that film embodies a very specific English intellectual variety. The man so completely convinced of his own superiority that he barely bothers concealing his. Contempt for the people around him, who deploys his intelligence as a social weapon, who regards every interaction as an opportunity to demonstrate the distance between himself and whoever he is talking to. This flavor of upper-class British intellectual arrogance, applied to an infant in diapers in a high chair, is the tonal contradiction that makes Stewie work at every structural level. The voice is doing enormous work. It carries the entire premise on its specific cadences. The other essential quality of early Stewie is the completeness of the commitment. The show does not wink at the audience about the absurdity of a dangerous baby. The show treats Stewie's murderous intentions with complete seriousness. His machines actually work. His attempts on Lois's life come genuinely close. His plans are actually intelligent plans, conceived by a mind that is genuinely capable of the scheming it describes. The comedy is not look at this little person pretending to be dangerous. The comedy is this person is genuinely dangerous and nobody in his immediate environment is capable of perceiving this because of the body he occupies. That is a subtler, more unsettling, more interesting joke, generating laughter that comes from understanding something the characters around Stewie fundamentally cannot. The decision to retire evil Stewie is one of the most consequential and most regrettable choices in the show's creative history. The stated rationale that the evil genius concept had been exhausted after 3 seasons does not survive examination. Family Guy has now produced considerably more seasons with the gentler, softer Stewie than it ever produced with the original Evil Genius version. If the writing room found sufficient material in the replacement character to sustain him across 15-plus seasons of television, the original concept, genuinely one of a kind in the history of the form, could surely have been sustained for more than 3. The Evil Genius Baby was not a single joke with a single punchline. It was a concept, the irreconcilable coexistence of supervillain intelligence and infant form that could have been taken in countless directions. New inventions, new plans, new targets, new contexts in which to play the fundamental contrast, the possibilities were genuinely enormous. The writers chose to walk away from all of them. What replaced the original is not without value. The Brian and Stewie friendship generates some of the show's most emotionally honest content. The Road to Adventure episodes are among the most consistently good material in the show's entire run, but there are hundreds of animated characters who are emotionally complex and searching for their identity. There was only one evil genius baby building laser guns between naps while his mother thought he was sleeping. That specific character was irreplaceable. The character that replaced him was not. Section 9. The Rhode Island setting and the small-town formula. The small, fictional New England city where the Griffin family lives operates as a comedic environment using a structural formula that The Simpsons had fully designed and deployed before Family Guy existed. Both towns run on the same mechanical logic, populated by the same categories of supporting characters performing the same structural narrative roles. The setting infrastructure is borrowed. The local labels on the components are new. The building was standing before Family Guy moved in. Springfield functions through a specific set of recurring character archetypes that together constitute a story-generating ecosystem. A news anchor who appears when the plot requires mass communication, when something happens that the whole town needs to know about, when the narrative requires a moment of public discourse. He is not a fully developed character. He is a structural component that performs a specific function reliably across every season. A doctor whose incompetence is of a recurring comic variety. A principal whose ineffectiveness is specific and repeated. A religious leader whose genuine sincerity generates comedy through misapplication. A wealthy antagonist whose power occasionally threatens the main family from above. A police department more comic than functional. A bar where the central male character spends too much time. Together, these components constitute a machine for generating story through their variable interactions. The Griffin family's town uses this identical machine. News anchor, doctor, mayor, police chief, religious figure, wealthy antagonist, bar. Each component has a different name and different specific personality, but performs the same structural function in the show's narrative ecosystem. The machine is borrowed. The labels differ. What MacFarlane added to the borrowed structural template is geographic and cultural specificity that The Simpsons deliberately avoided. Springfield was explicitly located nowhere as a running joke. Contradictory evidence about which state it occupied was planted deliberately across early seasons. And the ambiguity became part of the show's identity. This was a specific creative choice serving the show's ambition to comment on American society broadly rather than on any specific regional variety of it. MacFarlane chose the opposite approach. The Griffin family's town is placed explicitly in Rhode Island, in the cultural landscape of New England that MacFarlane knew from 4 years at RISD. This choice generates real and specific texture. Peter's cultural identity is grounded in the specific codes of working-class New England Irish Catholic life, the regional sports loyalties, the religious identity structure, the particular class dynamics of that part of the country. These details feel observed rather than invented, and genuine cultural observation gives the character a specificity that Homer's generic Midwestern everymanhood never attempted. King of the Hill, premiering on Fox in January 1997, 2 years before Family Guy, demonstrates what fully realized geographic and cultural specificity looks like in an animated comedy. It is set in a fictional Texas suburb, and every creative choice reflects deep, honest knowledge of that specific culture. Hank Hill is not a generic American man who happens to live in Texas. He is a specific kind of Texas man shaped by a specific regional culture with specific values and specific blindnesses and specific ways of understanding what a good life looks like. Creator Mike Judge grew up in Texas. The specificity runs all the way down to the smallest details of how people talk and what they avoid talking about and what they care about and why. Family Guy's New England specificity is real, but it does not run this deep. It runs through the surface layers, accents, cultural references, sports loyalties, class identity, and these are genuine contributions. But underneath them, the structural template is borrowed from a show deliberately designed to avoid geographic specificity. And the borrowed template shows through the local decoration when the genuine cultural knowledge is applied less consistently, as it was in the later seasons when the New England texture became thinner and the borrowed structure became more visible. The King of the Hill writing room reportedly expressed appreciation for the South Park critique of Family Guy's writing. People building shows on genuine cultural specificity develop sensitivity to the difference between authentic cultural grounding and decorative geographic application. They know what the real version feels like from inside the creative process, and they can identify when they are looking at decoration. Family Guy's setting is a microcosm of the show's larger creative relationship with its sources, genuine additions applied to a borrowed foundation, valuable when the additions are strong, revealing when they are thin. Section 10. Shock humor, edgy animation, and who did it first. The argument that Family Guy deserves credit for pushing the limits of primetime network animation contains a kernel of real truth that must be engaged honestly. Within the specific context of network broadcast television, network standards and practices, advertiser relationships, primetime scheduling, the show was doing things those networks had not previously permitted. That achievement is real in its specific context. But the argument is frequently extended to the broader claim that Family Guy was the edgiest or most transgressive adult animated content on American television. And this broader claim does not survive examination. The history of genuinely transgressive adult animation extends decades before Family Guy existed and goes considerably further than Family Guy was ever capable of going on a broadcast network. Ralph Bakshi began his career as an animator in the late 1960s and produced across the 1970s a body of work that went further than anything Family Guy attempted in any context whatsoever. Fritz the Cat, released in 1972, was the first animated film in American history to receive an X rating from the Motion Picture Association of America. It was explicitly sexual, politically confrontational about race and class and 1970s counterculture, and formally transgressive in ways the animation industry had not previously seen in an American theatrical release. Bakshi's subsequent films, Heavy Traffic in 1973, Coonskin in 1975, Wizards in 1977, continued in territory that broadcast television would never permit and that most cable networks would not distribute. Bakshi was making genuinely transgressive adult animation when McFarlane was in elementary school. The Ren and Stimpy Show, created by John Kricfalusi and premiering on Nickelodeon in August 1991, was aggressively transgressive for a children's cable network in ways that should permanently complicate the Family Guy edginess narrative. The animation was visually extreme, grotesque close-ups drawn with a detail and an ugliness that American children's television had never allowed. The emotional dynamics between the characters pushed into territory of genuine cruelty and dysfunction that Nickelodeon found increasingly difficult to rationalize. Kricfalusi was fired from his own show in 1992 for content that crossed the network's line. Being removed from a show you created because the content is too extreme is the clearest possible evidence of actual transgression. South Park is the comparison that most directly undermines the Family Guy claim to edginess, and it is the one most inconvenient to engage with. South Park premiered on Comedy Central in August 1997, 2 full years before Family Guy. From its very first episode, it was doing things that Family Guy could never do on a broadcast network. It used language that Fox's Standards and Practices division would simply not permit. It addressed specific current events and specific living public figures with an immediacy that animated production timelines made structurally impossible for network shows. It took hard positions on specific controversial questions in ways that a show dependent on broad advertiser support and primetime scheduling could never risk. The historically accurate claim is narrower but still meaningful. Family Guy was the edgiest adult animated comedy on prime-time broadcast network television at the turn of the millennium. Within those specific constraints, it was genuinely pushing against limits that previous prime-time animated shows had respected. But in the broader landscape of American adult animation at the same historical moment, Family Guy was not at the frontier. It was operating in the middle of a tradition that had been going considerably further for decades. The Saturday Night Live writing room had been doing sharper political comedy since 1975. Howard Stern had been pushing sexual frankness into mass media since the early 1980s. The Richard Pryor specials of the 1970s had said more honest and more specific things about race in America than Family Guy ever approached. What Family Guy genuinely contributed was the delivery context. A prime-time broadcast network platform making this material accessible to audiences who would not have encountered it in the venues where it already existed. That contextual novelty was a real cultural contribution. Millions of people were introduced to a style and sensibility of adult comedy through Family Guy that they would not otherwise have found because they did not have cable or did not seek out late-night specials. The platform was the genuine contribution. The content it delivered was borrowed. The shift toward pure shock value in the later seasons represents the specific failure mode of borrowed transgression. Transgression that generates genuine comedy requires intelligence and purpose. It uses darkness to say something, to arrive at a truth through a door that the polite entrance would not open. The early Family Guy did this inconsistently, but often enough to demonstrate the capability. The later seasons abandoned the intelligence in favor of the shock alone, discovering the structural limitation that was always going to arrive. Shock wears off. The first time an audience sees something genuinely extreme, it generates a response. The 10th time, they are habituated to it. The 100th time, they are bored by it. A show built on genuine cleverness can sustain novelty indefinitely because intelligence is renewable and its applications are endless. A show built primarily on escalating shock eventually runs out of runway and has nothing waiting on the other side. Section 11. American Dad did it better. Here is the most concrete and most quietly devastating piece of evidence in the entire argument about Family Guy's originality and its creative trajectory. Not a comparison from external critics. Not a satirical attack from a rival show. Evidence that comes from Seth MacFarlane's own second show. Same creator, same network, same Sunday night animation block. Launched the same month as Family Guy's revival. American Dad premiered on Fox on February 6, 2005, immediately following Super Bowl 39. Created by Seth MacFarlane alongside Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, the Smith family in Langley Falls, Virginia, Stan Smith, a patriotic conservative CIA agent, his wife Francine, their children Haley and Steve, Roger, a space alien living in their attic, Klaus, a German man whose brain the CIA transplanted into a goldfish body during a Cold War operation. Same creator. Same basic template of the dysfunctional family with a non-human character providing outsider perspective. Another animated family comedy for the Fox Sunday night lineup. The dismissal was immediate and nearly universal. Critics called it a lesser Family Guy spin-off. Audiences watched it largely because it aired right after Family Guy, and changing the channel required more effort than leaving the television on. Nobody was calling it the better show in 2005. Nobody was even calling it a particularly good show yet. It was filling a slot. Then MacFarlane, absorbed in the enormous cultural momentum of the Family Guy revival, handed American Dad to Barker and Weitzman and turned his primary creative attention to other things. He continued to voice Stan Smith, his character, his voice, present in every episode, but in terms of creative direction and day-to-day writing decisions, American Dad was Barker and Weitzman's project to develop. And what they did with it, quietly and without significant public notice, was make it genuinely excellent. The central decision that defined the show's creative trajectory was the choice not to use cutaway gags. Weitzman and Barker looked at the Family Guy format and made a conscious choice to build American Dad differently. No cutaways. Every episode would have to work as a complete story. Every comedy moment would have to emerge from the characters and the situations they found themselves in. No safety valve, no borrowed format to fall back on when the main narrative ran thin. The writing room would have to be genuine storytellers or the show would fail. This constraint transformed the creative culture. Without the cutaway escape route, the writers had to know their characters deeply enough to find comedy in who those characters actually are, in the collision of their genuine traits with circumstances that test those traits. Stan Smith is funny because his specific rigidity, his absolute conviction about how the world should work, his genuine inability to perceive the gap between his certainty and reality generates comedy when it meets resistance. This requires the audience to understand Stan as a specific person, and requires the writers to know him that way. It cannot be assembled from borrowed formulas. It has to be earned through character knowledge. Roger the Alien became one of the most beloved characters in adult animated television through a genuinely original decision: the ability to adopt completely different human personas, entirely different characters with different names, backstories, personalities, and relationships to the world. Birch Barlow, the right-wing radio host. Ricky Spanish, the sadistic villain. Sidney Huffman, the mild-mannered accountant. The Legman, the hard-boiled detective. Dozens upon dozens of completely different people who were simultaneously all Roger. This is genuinely original. It has no direct precedent in animated television. The mechanic means that Roger is, in creative terms, an inexhaustible resource. The writers can generate new material from him indefinitely because each persona opens new. Comedic territory without requiring development of a new character, since the underlying Roger remains constant beneath every surface performance. The concept was designed to be constantly self-renewing. It has been self-renewing for 20 seasons. American Dad is still finding new Roger personas in its latest episodes, still finding comedy in the gap between whoever Roger is currently performing and the alien underneath. Compare this to what happened with Stewie, the original evil genius concept, genuinely one of a kind, one of the most original character inventions in the history of the form, was retired because the writing room lost confidence in their ability to find new angles for it. They replaced the irreplaceable with a softer, more accessible character type that any number of other shows could have produced. Roger's persona mechanic went in the opposite direction, starting from a borrowed alien comedy premise and adding genuine original invention that grew more valuable with each. Passing season. The characters of American Dad maintained their integrity across the show's run in ways Family Guy's characters did not. Stan Smith evolved from a one-dimensional conservative caricature into a genuinely complex character, still rigidly wrong about many things, still blind to himself in specific ways, but capable of genuine love and real emotional growth that accumulates across seasons rather than resetting each episode. Francine Smith maintained her personality coherently. The family felt like people who genuinely cared about each other even when fighting, the warmth that Family Guy's early seasons had and progressively lost. The American Dad comparison matters most because it eliminates the most common defense of Family Guy's decline, that creative degradation over 20-plus seasons is inevitable, that no show can sustain quality at this scale for this long. American Dad has been running for essentially the same period and has not suffered the same catastrophic decline. It lost viewers too. Every broadcast network show loses viewers across decades, but its creative quality remained far more consistent. The longevity defense fails. Family Guy's decline was not caused by time. It was caused by choices, specific, traceable, reversible choices that were made, unmade, remade, and ultimately compounded across seasons until the show that once felt genuinely alive became a machine, producing approximate versions of its former self. The show that nobody expected to matter turned out to matter more than the show everyone was watching. The borrowed foundation was the same for both. The genuine additions were different. The genuine additions made all the difference. Section 12. Does any of this matter? Legacy and the originality question. We are at the end now. Let the room be quiet for a moment. Let everything we have moved through together settle into a shape that can be held and carried. We have traced the Larry Shorts and their direct continuity into Family Guy's characters and jokes. We have mapped the Simpsons blueprint room by room, from the fathers to the mothers to the children to the supporting character ecosystem. We have followed the lineage of the dysfunctional American television family back through 50 years to Ralph Kramden in 1955. We have named the actual inventors of the cutaway gag format, vaudeville, Laugh-In, Monty Python, and traced its path to Family Guy. We have identified the borrowed archetypes behind Peter, Brian, and Stewie, and what was genuinely original within each character. We have examined the setting's borrowed infrastructure and the limits of the show's claimed edginess. We have watched American Dad demonstrate by quietly getting better every season that Family Guy's problems were choices and not inevitabilities. The full picture is assembled, and the question the full picture generates is the only one that was ever worth asking. Does it matter that Family Guy was not original? The first answer is no, and it is genuinely defensible. Art is not a competition for novelty. It is a human activity aimed at connection and pleasure, and the alleviation of loneliness. And whether the techniques employed were developed by someone else does not diminish the experience of the work. Family Guy made hundreds of millions of people laugh across 26 years of production. It gave them characters they felt genuine affection for, the early Peter and his specific warmth, the early Brian and his specific interior loneliness, the early Stewie and all. His committed malevolence, even Meg, and the recognizable pain of being the family member nobody quite sees. It gave some of those people a reason to stay up past midnight. A voice in the dark that made the room feel less empty. A genuine source of pleasure during periods when that was hard to find. The borrowed foundations do not undo any of that. The borrowed jokes do not cancel the real laughter. The genuineness of the responses belong to the people who had them, and nothing in this conversation reaches backward in time to remove them. The laughter was real. The affection was real. The borrowed origin of the material that generated them is a fact about the show's history, but not a fact that erases what the show generated. Borrowing is not a disqualification. Every great creative work participates in a tradition. The tradition is built to be participated in. Shakespeare borrowed and produced immortal work. Kurosawa borrowed and produced immortal work. Dylan borrowed and produced immortal work. The act of borrowing, done with genuine skill and genuine human truth, generates legitimate creative achievement. Family Guy did this. In its best seasons, the early seasons, it borrowed well. It added specific, genuine qualities to the borrowed foundation, the New England cultural specificity, the warmth of the early family, the genuinely original Stewie concept, the specific interior honesty of early Brian. These were real contributions, and they generated something worth the affection people gave it. But the second answer is yes, it matters, and it is equally defensible, and it is more interesting and more useful in the long run. It matters because the specific nature of Family Guy's borrowings is the specific mechanical explanation for what went wrong with it, and understanding that explanation converts. The story of the show's decline from a mysterious tragedy into a legible narrative with identifiable causes and traceable consequences. A creative work built on genuinely original foundations has a renewable source of creative energy. Original ideas have implications not yet explored, angles not yet tried, depths not yet sounded. When writers return to them season after season, there is always more material available because the original ideas are deep enough to reward sustained excavation. The well is deep because it was dug in original soil. The work of discovering what the original ideas contain can sustain a show across decades. A creative work built primarily on borrowed foundations has a different relationship with time. The borrowed elements arrive complete, fully developed in the original contexts from which they were taken. Their implications and depths belong to those original contexts. When writers return to them season after season, they are working with copies, and copies degrade in ways that originals do not. The further any given season is from the genuine additions that had made the borrowed framework worth using, the more clearly the borrowed skeleton shows through the surface. This is exactly what happened to Family Guy. The early seasons combined borrowed foundations with genuine additions, the specific New England cultural texture, the warmth of the early family dynamic. The original conception of Stewie, the specific interiority of early Brian, and those genuine additions were enough to make the borrowed framework feel like something worth watching, something specific and human and occasionally brilliant. The genuine additions covered the borrowed skeleton with real flesh. The middle and later seasons progressively removed those additions without replacing them with anything equivalent. Peter's genuine warmth and cultural specificity were stripped away in favor of escalating cruelty. Brian's genuine interiority was replaced by familiar pretentiousness. Stewie's genuine originality was traded for a softer, safer character type. Meg was reduced from a relatable teenager to a sustained target of cruelty. The cutaway format, already borrowed, was deployed at increasing frequency as a substitute for the genuine storytelling the stripped-away character qualities could no longer support. The borrowed skeleton was exposed, layer by layer, season by season. American Dad proves the alternative was always available. Same borrowed foundation. Same basic structural template. Same creator's name on the credits. Different creative choices. Roger's persona mechanic added genuine original invention to the borrowed premise. The commitment to storytelling without cutaway crutches forced the writing room to develop genuine character knowledge. The characters were allowed to grow rather than being pushed to extremes for comic effect. The result is a show that has sustained genuine creative quality across the same span of years that saw Family Guy fall apart. The borrowed framework did not doom Family Guy. The choices made about what to put on top of it did. The lesson, and there is a lesson here that extends well beyond Family Guy specifically, is about the relationship between borrowed foundations and genuine additions in Long. Running creative work. Borrowed foundations are fine. They are normal. They are how tradition works. But borrowed foundations require ongoing genuine investment to remain functional as the basis for creative work across decades. You cannot borrow a template and execute it indefinitely without adding genuine human truth of your own. The template will not sustain itself. It needs the flesh of genuine creative investment to maintain its shape. And when that flesh is removed, what remains is a borrowed skeleton, recognizable in shape, capable of performing versions of the movements it used to make naturally, but hollow. At its core, Family Guy gave us the flesh for a few seasons. The flesh was real and specific and worth the affection it generated. Then the choices were made, season by season, that removed the flesh and left the skeleton performing a slow exhibition of its own emptiness. The borrowed skeleton is still there. The show is still airing. But what made it worth watching was never the skeleton. It was always the flesh. If you made it all the way here, whether you are still present, or whether this video carried you off into sleep somewhere around section 8, and you are reading this in the morning, thank you, genuinely and specifically for being here. This kind of long, slow, careful conversation is what this channel exists to make, and the fact that you chose to spend this much time with it means something real. Drop a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is. I read every single one of them, These comment sections are one of the best parts of making these videos. All those specific places and specific times of night, all those different people lying in the dark, listening to the same words about a show they spent years caring about. If this helped your mind settle tonight, if it gave your brain something to follow into sleep instead of the usual noise, if you found yourself genuinely thinking about television and creativity and what we borrow from each other and why it matters, that is everything these videos are made for. Hit subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. It is free. It matters more than you might realize, and I will see you in the next video. Good night. End of script, Uncle Guy lore. Estimated narration runtime at ASMR pace, approximately 2.5 to 3 hours. The relationship between Peter Griffin and the specific television tradition he descends from becomes even more visible when you look at the show's treatment of his friendships. Specifically his friendship with Joe Swanson. When Joe was introduced in the very first season in the episode A Hero Sits Next Door, he was introduced as someone Peter was actually jealous of. Joe was cool. Joe was capable. Joe was in a wheelchair but commanded more respect and admiration from the neighborhood than Peter did, and Peter's response to this was a genuine and human feeling of inadequacy. That the show handled with specific warmth. The episode ends with Peter and Joe becoming genuine friends, and the friendship felt earned because it was grounded in mutual respect that had to overcome Peter's initial insecurity. That dynamic, Peter becoming jealous of a friend's capability and then working through that jealousy into genuine respect, is exactly the emotional structure that made the early show work. It is the structure of a man who is aware, on some level, of his own limitations, who sometimes responds badly to that awareness, but who can be brought around to something better by circumstances and relationships that matter to him. This is the warmth that made early Peter human rather than merely funny. By the later seasons, Joe Swanson's disability had been converted from a character trait into a punchline. The man that Peter was once jealous of for his capability became the man that the group mocked for his disability. The emotional structure of the relationship inverted completely. Peter went from a character who overcame jealousy to recognize genuine worth in a friend, to a character who used a friend's vulnerability as a source of comedy. This inversion is not a creative choice made for artistic reasons. It is the byproduct of the progressive removal of the emotional structure that made the early relationship meaningful. When the warmth is removed, what occupies the space it left is the easiest available alternative, which in comedy tends to be cruelty. The transformation of Peter's relationship with Joe mirrors the broader transformation of Peter himself. And both of them mirror the broader transformation of the show. The early Family Guy was built on an emotional structure, imperfect people loving each other imperfectly, failing and recognizing failure and trying again. That came directly from the best traditions of the dysfunctional family comedy, going back to Norman Lear. The later Family Guy dismantled that emotional structure piece by piece and replaced it with nothing. The borrowed archetype was all that remained, performing the shape of its former self without the animating feeling that had made the shape meaningful. What is most striking, looking back at the arc of Peter Griffin across the full run of the show, is how completely the character's trajectory reflects the show's own trajectory. The early Peter, warm, dumb, genuinely loving, represents the show at its most genuinely engaged with what it was supposed to be. The late Peter, cruel, disconnected, finding humor in suffering, represents the show at its most disengaged, running on borrowed momentum, without genuine creative investment. Peter Griffin became, over 25 years, a mirror of his own show's relationship to its own sources, alive and specific in the early years when genuine investment covered. The borrowed bones, hollow and mechanical in the later years, when the investment withdrew and only the borrowed skeleton remained. The specific quality of early Brian that is most worth examining carefully is his relationship to his own failures, because this is where the genuine creative contribution is. Most specific and most human. Brian has been working on a novel for years. Not vaguely working on it, the way characters in lesser shows have background ambitions that never quite come into focus. Specifically working on it, returning to it, failing to complete it, and experiencing that failure in ways the show depicts with honest specificity in the early seasons. The manuscript exists. The chapters pile up. The ending never arrives. And Brian's response to this failure, the way it generates both the drinking and the intellectual overcompensation, the way he talks about other writers and other books with a knowledgeability that is simultaneously genuine and defensive, is the kind of character writing that requires the writer to know what creative failure actually feels like from inside it. This is a specific and unusual thing to do with a comedy character, particularly an animated one. Comedy characters are typically defined by what they do, the comedic situations they generate, the punchlines they deliver. Defining a character substantially by what they have not done and cannot do, by the gap between what they believe themselves capable of and what they have actually produced, requires treating the character as a person rather than as a comedic mechanism. It requires finding the comedy in something that is genuinely not funny, the quiet desperation of sustained creative failure, without losing the genuine sadness underneath the comedy. The early Brian managed this balance consistently, and it is this management that represents the genuine creative achievement. The talking animal tradition, as we have established, was in place long before Brian, but no previous entry in that tradition had used the talking animal as a vehicle for this specific kind of creative failure portrait. Alf had appetites and opinions. Mr. Ed had loyalty and cleverness. The animals in Aesop's fables had wisdom or foolishness deployed in service of moral illustration. Brian had an unfinished novel sitting in a drawer and the specific kind of self-aware dishonesty that people who have not finished the things they told themselves they would finish tend to develop as a defense mechanism against the awareness of their own incompleteness. The loss of this specific quality in the later Brian is not simply a matter of the character becoming less likable. It is a loss of the show's most specific and honest engagement with a form of human experience that is almost never depicted in animated comedy. Failed creative ambition. The specific grinding disappointment of the person who believed in their own potential and is confronted daily with the gap between the potential and. The result is not a subject that family comedies typically address with honesty. The early Family Guy addressed it through Brian with enough precision and enough genuine feeling to make the character feel like someone real. When that quality was removed and replaced with the pretentious blowhard of the later seasons, the show lost not just a likable character, but its only connection to that specific form of human honesty. The irony is that the later Brian, the pretentious and self-aggrandizing version, is in some ways more recognizable as a type than the early Brian. There are many fictional portraits of the insufferable intellectual who mistake sophistication for wisdom. They populate literature and film and television in large numbers. What was rare was the portrait of the person who wants desperately to be that sophisticated intellectual, who reaches for it daily, and who has enough honest self-awareness to know on the days when the self-awareness breaks through the defense mechanisms that the reach keeps exceeding the grasp. That was early Brian. That was something genuinely specific and genuinely true, and it was traded for a familiar type that required no creative excavation to produce. The specific genius of early Stewie that is most easily overlooked is the dramatic irony structure that his existence created across the entire show. Most of the adult characters around Stewie cannot understand what he is saying. They hear babbling when they look at him. They see an infant. They respond to him with the cooing, simplified language that adults use toward babies, completely oblivious to the elaborate villainous speeches being delivered in response. This creates a specific and sustained comedic structure that has a different quality from most comedy. It is not just funny. It is funny and slightly uncomfortable simultaneously, because the audience is in on a joke that the characters are structurally prevented from perceiving. This specific structure, the audience knowing something fundamental that the characters cannot know, the dramatic irony sustained across seasons rather than deployed as a single. Twist is one of the more sophisticated comedic mechanisms Family Guy deployed in its early seasons. And it is a mechanism that the show borrowed from the best part of its own tradition. The Simpsons used dramatic irony brilliantly in specific episodes. Monty Python deployed audience knowledge as a comic resource constantly, but using it as a sustained structural element across the entirety of one character's existence across multiple seasons, making an entire character's premise depend on the audience knowing something the other characters fundamentally cannot. This specific deployment belonged to Stewie and to Family Guy. The gradual removal of this structure as Stewie's character changed was one of the specific losses that accompanied the retirement of the evil genius concept. As Stewie became warmer and more emotionally accessible, as the other characters began to engage with him more directly and more honestly, the irony structure dissolved. Stewie stopped being the character the audience understood in ways the other characters could not. He became just another character in the household, interacting with the others on more or less equal terms, generating comedy through personality and situation rather than through structural dramatic irony. This is a legitimate way to generate comedy. It just requires giving up something that was specifically valuable and specifically original. The season 6 two-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie is often discussed as the show's farewell to the original Stewie concept, and the reading is accurate. These two episodes are the most ambitious thing the show ever did with the evil genius character. Stewie finally achieves what he has been pursuing since the pilot episode, achieves it completely, takes over the world, becomes the dictator he always planned to become, and then everything resets. It was a simulation on Stewie's computer. The whole thing was undone. And after those episodes, the evil genius concept was quietly retired. The choice to undo it, to refuse to let the consequences stand, is the most revealing moment in the show's relationship with its own characters. A show willing to live with permanent consequences would have let Stewie kill Lois, or would have found a genuine dramatic resolution to the contradiction at the heart of the character. Instead, the show chose to give the audience everything the evil genius concept promised, and then take it back, resetting to a status quo that would gradually shift away from the evil genius altogether. The character who was too original to let go of was also, it turned out, too challenging to sustain. The simulation ending was the show finding a way to have it both ways, and in doing so it lost both. EXpansion_Sectian_9. There is one additional dimension of the setting question that is worth exploring, because it connects the borrowed infrastructure of the fictional town to the broader question of how the show used or failed to use its borrowed foundations over time. The small fictional American town as a comedic setting has a specific relationship to the characters who live in it. The town is not just backdrop. It is a narrative ecosystem that generates story through the specific ways its components interact with the main family. When the town works well as a comedic setting, it feels like a community that the characters are genuinely embedded in, that responds to them, and is shaped by them, and shapes them in return. Springfield at its best feels like this. The specific texture of Springfield is inseparable from the specific qualities of the Simpson family, because the family and the town were developed together across decades of sustained creative work. Homer's relationship to Moe's bar, Bart's relationship to Principal Skinner, the specific dynamic between the Simpsons family and Mr. Burns. These feel like relationships that have accumulated genuine history, because the show put in the sustained creative work to develop them. The Griffin family's town at its best feels like this too, particularly in the early seasons when the show was most invested in its specific regional identity. The Drunken Clam feels like a real bar in a real Rhode Island town. Peter's friends feel like people you might actually know from that specific kind of working-class New England community. The cultural texture gives the setting a specificity that the borrowed template alone could not provide. But this specificity required ongoing creative investment to maintain. When the investment withdrew in the later seasons, the setting reverted to the borrowed template. A generic animated sitcom town with Rhode Island labels applied, and the show lost the sense that its characters were actually embedded in a specific real-seeming community. expansion_Sectian_10. There is also a specific way that the shift from smart dark comedy to pure shock value undermine the show's relationship with its audience that is worth examining carefully. Genuine dark comedy has a transactional quality. It is offering the audience something in exchange for their discomfort, a truth, an insight, a laugh that comes from recognition of something real. The discomfort is the price. The illumination is the product. When the exchange is fair, the audience accepts the discomfort willingly, because what they get in return is worth it. Pure shock value breaks this transaction. It offers discomfort in exchange for nothing except more discomfort. There is no illumination. There is no truth. There is just the shock itself, offered with the implicit argument that the willingness to go further than other shows is itself a form of quality. It is not. Willingness to go further is a production choice, not a creative achievement. What you do with the distance you have traveled is the creative achievement, and shock value does nothing with the distance except measure it. The early Family Guy understood this distinction, at least intermittently. The dark comedy of the early seasons had specific targets and specific purposes. Stewie's attempts on Lois's life were funny because of the irony structure, not because violence against mothers is inherently amusing. Peter's failures had consequences that shaped his relationships with the people around him. The darkness served the comedy, which served the truth, which made the discomfort worth accepting. The later Family Guy reversed this completely. The darkness became the point. The discomfort became the product. And the audience was left holding the discomfort with nothing offered in exchange. expansion_section_11. The American Dad comparison is sharpest when you focus on a specific detail that rarely gets mentioned in discussions of the two shows. The treatment of the female characters. In Family Guy, Lois Griffin progressively became more cynical and more distant as the seasons accumulated, mirroring the broader pattern of character degradation across the show. Meg became a sustained target of cruelty so extreme that it generated genuine critical discussion about what the show was saying about young women who simply want to be accepted. The show's female characters degraded in ways that paralleled the degradation of the male characters, but often more severely because they had less narrative protection. In American Dad, Francine Smith maintained a coherent character identity across the show's run. She is warm and sometimes naively cheerful, but also capable of genuine darkness and genuine anger. She is funny in ways that come from who she actually is, rather than from what happens to her. Haley evolved from a one-dimensional liberal strawman counterpoint to Stan into a genuine character with her own relationships and her own specific complicated personality. The show's female characters were treated as people with their own interiority rather than as objects of various comedic treatments. This difference is not accidental. It reflects the specific creative discipline that the no-cutaway gags constraint enforced on American Dad's writing room. When you cannot fall back on disconnected gags, you have to develop characters deeply enough that the interactions between them generate the comedy. Deep character development requires treating every character as a person with a specific interior life. You cannot develop Francine Smith deeply enough to generate comedy from her interactions with Stan without knowing who Francine Smith actually is. Knowing who Francine Smith actually is requires writing her as a person rather than as a function. And writing women as persons rather than as functions is how you avoid the specific degradation that Family Guy inflicted on Lois and Meg over its run. The borrowed foundation was the same. The creative choices built on top of it were different. The different choices produced better characters, and better characters produced better television. That is the whole lesson of the American Dad comparison, stated simply. Better choices produce better television. Family Guy made worse choices. Family Guy made worse television as a result. The borrowed foundation was not the cause. The choices were the cause. The question of what makes creative work genuinely valuable as opposed to simply successful, or popular, or commercially viable, is one that the Family Guy story illuminates. In a specific and useful way, the show was all three of those things at its peak: genuinely valuable in its early seasons, enormously successful and popular for most of its run, and commercially viable to such an extreme degree that it continues to be produced decades past the point where the creative justification for its continuation is clear. But those three qualities are not the same quality, and the show's history demonstrates the gap between them with unusual clarity. Genuine value in creative work comes from specific human truth. The specific, observed, honest portrayal of something real about human experience that you did not quite know or could not quite articulate until the work showed it to you. Family Guy, in its best moments, had this: the specific loneliness of early Brian, the specific warmth of the early Griffin family underneath all the chaos, the specific absurdity of Stewie's constitutive irreconcilability. These were specific and honest, and they generated something in the audience that went beyond the mere recognition of a good joke. They generated the feeling of having been understood, of having had something about your own experience reflected back to you, which is the deepest thing comedy can do, and the hardest thing to produce. Success and popularity are measurements of something different. They measure reach and resonance at a specific cultural moment. The early Family Guy had all three: the genuine value and the success and the popularity, all at once. But success and popularity can outlast genuine value significantly because the cultural momentum that genuine value generates tends to persist long after the genuine value itself has been removed from the work. People watched Family Guy in its middle and later seasons partly out of habit, partly out of loyalty to the genuine value the early seasons had provided, partly because the cutaway format occasionally still produced moments that were funny even if the surrounding episode was hollow. The inertia of past quality kept audiences returning to a show that was no longer producing the quality that had attracted them in the first place. Commercial viability outlasts both, because commercial viability is not connected to quality at all. It is connected to cost, to brand recognition, to the accumulated value of intellectual property that can be monetized in merchandise and reruns and streaming licenses and 100 other revenue streams that have nothing to do with whether the show being produced this week is good or bad. Family Guy will continue to be commercially viable as long as the Griffin family brand holds value in the licensing and streaming marketplace, which will likely be for decades. Beyond any point at which the show stops producing genuine creative value, assuming it has not already passed that point. Understanding these distinctions does not require rejecting the genuine quality the early show had. It requires holding both things simultaneously, the genuine value that the early seasons produced, and the specific loss of that value that the later seasons represent. Both are true. The early seasons were brilliant in specific and identifiable ways that go beyond mere popularity. The later seasons are commercially successful products that perform the shape of their former excellence without the animating genuine investment that made the early excellence possible. Family Guy's story is the story of that gap widening over time between the genuine value of the early work and the commercial viability of the brand built on that works. Reputation. The brand persists because the early work earned it. The early work is no longer being produced. What is being produced is the brand's continuation, maintained by institutional momentum and business logic, generating approximate versions of something that was once specific and alive. This is not a unique story. Television has produced many versions of it. Shows that began with genuine creative investment, built audiences through that investment, and then continued producing for audiences who remembered the investment long after. The investment itself had withdrawn. The specific version of this story that Family Guy tells is unusual in two respects. First, the show's borrowings make the story more visible than usual, because borrowed foundations degrade in ways that original ones do not, exposing the gap between the early genuine quality and the later approximate version more clearly. Second, the existence of American Dad provides a simultaneous counter-narrative that prevents the usual defense that creative decline across long runs is simply inevitable from being available. The defense was always available before American Dad demonstrated otherwise. Now it is not. The story of Family Guy is ultimately the story of borrowed materials used brilliantly in the early seasons and then allowed to degrade across the subsequent ones. It is the story of genuine additions, original Stewie, original Brian, the specific warmth of the early family that were the real creative contribution, and of those additions being progressively removed in favor of escalating shock and borrowed format. It is the story of a creator who stepped back, and of a writing room that continued without the specific understanding that had animated the best work. It is the story of a show that knew what it was at its best and chose, season by season, to be something less. And it is the story of a parallel show that made different choices and produced better television as a result. These are not comfortable stories. They involve acknowledging that something beloved was not as original as it seemed, and that the decline that followed was not inevitable but chosen, and that the choices were visible in real time to anyone paying careful attention. But they are honest stories, and honest stories are the ones worth telling at 2 a.m. when the usual defenses are down, and the quiet of the room allows for the kind of thinking that actually goes somewhere. Family Guy was never original. In its best seasons, it was something genuinely true and specifically funny in ways the borrowed foundation alone cannot explain. The genuine additions were real and worth the affection they generated. Their loss was a real loss. The show that airs today is what a borrowed skeleton looks like when the flesh has been removed and the skeleton does not know or does not care that it is bare. _expansion_Sectian_one. There is something specific about the late-night context of this conversation that is worth naming, because it connects to why this particular Subject is worth lingering over carefully. During the day, conversations about creative borrowing and originality tend to become arguments fairly quickly. The parties dig into positions. The person defending Family Guy's originality digs into that position. The person questioning it digs into the opposite one. The conversation generates more heat than light and ends where it began, with both parties more firmly committed to their starting positions than they were before. At night, something different becomes possible. The argumentative defenses go down along with the ambient noise. What is left is the capacity to simply look at something carefully and hold multiple true things about it simultaneously. The capacity to say, Family Guy was not original in its fundamental structures, and Family Guy was genuinely good in its early seasons, and both of these things are completely true, and neither one cancels the other, and understanding both of them together gives you a much more honest and much more useful picture of the show than either one alone. That dual understanding is what this conversation has been trying to build. Not an argument for or against Family Guy, but an honest examination of what it actually was, where it actually came from, what it genuinely contributed, and what the specific relationship between its borrowed foundations and its genuine contributions had to do with everything that happened to it over 25 years. The picture that emerges from this examination is complicated in the way that honestly examined things tend to be complicated. The show was built on borrowed materials and executed them brilliantly in its best years. The execution was brilliant, partly because the person doing it had been working with the same borrowed and refined materials for years before the public saw them. The brilliance generated genuine cultural value, specific original characters embedded in a borrowed structure, a warmth and humanity layered over the borrowed bones that made the whole thing feel alive. And then the brilliance was followed by a long and traceable decline in which the genuine additions were progressively removed and the borrowed foundations were progressively exposed. The examination also produces a specific and useful lesson about the relationship between originality and longevity in creative work that extends beyond Family Guy specifically. Shows that build on genuinely original foundations, that generate their own creative depth rather than borrowing it from established sources, have different resources to draw on across long runs. The original foundations have depths that reward sustained excavation, implications that generate new material across many seasons, angles not yet tried that can renew the creative enterprise when the first approaches begin to wear. Shows built primarily on borrowed foundations can produce excellent work. The early Family Guy is evidence of this, but the borrowed foundations do not have these depths. They have the depths of their original sources which belong to those sources. The borrowed material can be used well or badly, but it cannot be owned, cannot be developed, cannot be excavated deeper than the original sources have already excavated it. Family Guy ran into this limitation eventually, as shows built on borrowed foundations tend to do. The borrowed framework of The Simpsons inflected dysfunctional family comedy had been developed as far as it could be developed within that context. The borrowed cutaway format had been deployed at every frequency and in every variation available to it. What remained when the borrowed elements had been exhausted was either the genuine additions that the show had developed on top of the borrowed foundation, or nothing. In the early seasons, the genuine additions were there, and they were strong. By the time the borrowed elements had run their course, the genuine additions had been removed. Nothing remained but the borrowed structure performing the motions of its former self. Large E underscore EX Pansian, Sectin underscore THREE. The Simpsons comparison becomes even more illuminating when you consider the specific way the two shows handled their central romantic relationships, because this is one of the places where the borrowing goes deepest and where the genuine additions and eventual losses are most visible. Homer and Marge's marriage is the emotional core of The Simpsons in its best seasons. The relationship is built on a specific dynamic that the show developed with genuine care across early seasons. Homer's love for Marge is genuine and deep and expressed primarily through specific actions rather than through words. Because Homer is not a man who has the self-awareness or the verbal sophistication to articulate his feelings accurately. Marge's love for Homer is similarly genuine but expressed differently. Through patience, through loyalty, through a persistent choice to see the best in a man who regularly makes that difficult. The marriage works as a comedic and emotional foundation because both parties are specific and both are honestly portrayed. Peter and Lois's marriage in the early seasons follows this template closely enough that critics noted the resemblance immediately. Lois is patient in ways that mirror Marge's patience. Peter's love is genuine in ways that mirror Homer's love. The specific texture of how the two relationships are portrayed differs. The New England cultural context gives the Griffin marriage different specific qualities than the generic Midwestern context gives the Simpson marriage, but the emotional architecture is borrowed. What the early Family Guy added to this borrowed architecture was a specific quality of genuine playfulness between Peter and Lois that The Simpsons, at its best, also had, but that Family Guy executed with particular warmth in its first few seasons. The early Peter and Lois genuinely liked each other, found each other funny, had a physical and emotional intimacy that felt observed rather than constructed. These early seasons made the relationship feel like a specific marriage between two specific people rather than a marriage between two comedy archetypes. That specificity is genuinely valuable, and it is genuinely lost in the later seasons when the relationship became colder and more mechanical and Lois became progressively more like a prop in Peter's comedy than a specific person he was in a relationship with. Large E _ expansion _ section _ 5. The specific viral quality of the Family Guy cutaway gag deserves its own examination because it represents one of the genuine cultural contributions the show made that goes beyond the question of whether the format was original. When YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned from cancellation for its fourth season, it created an entirely new distribution context for comedy. Short, self-contained comic moments that could be extracted from their original context and circulated independently suddenly had a platform that was specifically designed for them. Family Guy's cutaway format, which produced self-contained comic units of exactly the right length for YouTube sharing, was ideally suited to this new distribution context. The show became one of the most shared programs on early YouTube in large part because of this accidental alignment between the cutaway format and the emerging viral video culture. Clips of individual cutaway gags accumulated millions of views independently of the episodes they came from. The show generated a kind of parallel cultural presence through clip culture that shows with more traditional narrative structures could not replicate. Because traditional narrative comedy requires context to work, and the cutaway gag specifically does not. It is complete in itself. It does not require the episode around it to be comprehensible. This made it uniquely shareable. The cultural contribution here is real and should not be minimized. Family Guy helped establish the specific vocabulary of early internet comedy clip culture, and the influence of that establishment extended well beyond the show itself into how humor circulated online for the following decade. But this contribution is at the level of deployment and timing, rather than invention. The format that drove this cultural impact was borrowed. The cultural impact itself was a byproduct of using a borrowed format at the specific historical moment when a new distribution platform was emerging that happened to suit the borrowed format perfectly. It was not design. It was alignment. The contribution was real, but it was not born of original creative vision. It was born of lucky timing and a borrowed technique. Large _ expansion _ section _ 2LV. The practical question that the story of Family Guy raises, what should actually be done differently with a show that finds itself in this situation, is worth engaging with directly, even if the answer is ultimately academic in the case of Family Guy specifically, which has been renewed through season 27. The answer the story points toward is simple in statement and difficult in execution. Protect the genuine editions. The borrowed foundations are sturdy enough to need no protection. They have been in circulation for 50 years and will continue to function long after any particular version of them is forgotten. What requires protection is the specific genuine contributions layered over those foundations, the characters built with specific human truth, the relationships written with. Specific warmth. The original creative inventions that distinguish this specific version of the template from all the others. In Family Guy's specific case, this would have meant protecting original Stewie, finding new angles for the evil genius concept rather than retiring it in favor of an easier character. It would have meant maintaining the specific warmth of the early family dynamic even as the show pushed its comedy further. It would have meant treating Brian's failure as a writer with the ongoing creative seriousness it received in the early seasons rather than converting it into a single character, trait among several equally hollow ones. It would have meant keeping Peter's genuine love for his family as the emotional anchor that made his comedy legible even when it was extreme. None of this required abandoning the borrowed foundations. It only required continuing to invest genuinely in the additions that had made those foundations worth using. This is not a difficult principle to articulate. It is genuinely difficult to maintain across decades of production, across writing room changes, across shifting commercial pressures and changing audience expectations and the natural drift that any long-running creative enterprise undergoes. Maintaining it requires someone who cares about the specific genuine quality of the work more than they care about the commercial viability of the product. In Family Guy's case, the person who cared most about the specific genuine quality stepped back, and in his absence, the commercial viability of the product continued without the specific genuine quality. Because commercial viability does not require it. American Dad had the specific good fortune of having its creative stewardship handled by people who, perhaps because they were less attached to the commercial success of the enterprise, cared more about the specific genuine quality of the work. Barker and Weitzman built something on the borrowed foundation that was genuinely theirs. They protected the genuine additions and continued developing them. The result is a show that has not suffered the same catastrophic gap between early quality and later quality, and that provides the clearest possible evidence that the gap in Family Guy was not inevitable but chosen. There is a dimension of Family Guy's creative history that gets lost in discussions focused primarily on the question of originality versus borrowing, and it is worth exploring because it adds texture to everything else we have discussed. The show's 3-year cancellation period, from 2002, when Fox canceled it for the second time, through 2005, when it returned for its 4th season, was not just a gap in production. It was a transformation event that changed the show in ways that are directly relevant to the question of what it borrowed and what it genuinely developed. When the show came back in 2005, it came back into a completely different media landscape. YouTube had launched. Digital video sharing had become part of the cultural fabric. The internet had changed the relationship between television programs and their audiences in ways that nobody had fully worked out yet. And the specific format of Family Guy, the self-contained cutaway gags that worked perfectly as standalone shareable clips, was aligned with this new landscape in a way that the show's creators had not anticipated and did not initially understand. The return of Family Guy in 2005 generated an enormous amount of cultural noise, much more than the return of a canceled show would typically generate, because of the Adult Swim reruns and the DVD sales that had built a cult following during the 3-year gap. The show came back with an audience that was larger and more devoted than the one it had left behind in 2002. And that audience was now embedded in a media culture that was actively looking for shareable comedy content. Family Guy's cutaway format was perfectly positioned to serve this demand. The clips circulated. The show became one of the most discussed programs on the early internet. The cultural footprint of the fourth season was enormous. But this success had a specific effect on the creative direction of the show going forward, and that effect is directly relevant to the originality question. When you discover that your borrowed format is generating enormous cultural success through its perfect alignment with a new distribution platform, the rational creative response, rational in a business sense, damaging in a creative sense, is to produce more of it. To lean into the format. To generate more shareable clip material. To structure episodes around the production of individual viral moments rather than around the development of character and story. And this is, broadly, what happened to Family Guy after 2005. The show leaned into the cutaway format. The cutaways became longer, more frequent, more central. The format that had been borrowed from Monty Python and Laugh-In was now also being optimized for YouTube. And the optimization for YouTube pushed the format further and further, away from the storytelling function it had originally supplemented, and toward pure, standalone clip generation. The borrowing that had been a creative choice in the early seasons became, after 2005, a business strategy. And business strategies are not the same as creative choices. A creative choice serves the work. A business strategy serves the revenue. When the cutaway gag became a business strategy optimized for viral clip culture, it stopped being in service of the comedy and started being the purpose of the production. The episodes existed to generate clips. The clips generated cultural noise. The cultural noise generated audience. The audience justified renewal. The renewal generated more episodes. The episodes existed to generate clips. This is a loop, and it is not a creative loop. It is a commercial loop with creativity attached to the outside as decoration. The Simpsons did not have this problem. Partly because it was already established enough by 2005 not to need viral clip culture to sustain its audience, and partly because its format, the couch gag contained in its box, the main episode as sustained narrative, was not as well suited to the clip economy. The Simpsons made good television for its established audience. Family Guy made viral clips for the new media culture. Both approaches were commercially successful. Only one produced better work over time. The distinction between making television and making viral content disguised as television is one that became increasingly important across the period we are discussing. And Family Guy's history illustrates it with unusual clarity. The early Family Guy was making television. The comedy had a context. Characters and situations generating comedy through interaction with those situations. The cutaways were additions to that context, not replacements for it. The later Family Guy was primarily making clips. The context, the episode's narrative, the characters' stories, was the scaffolding holding the clips together rather than the purpose of the production. The clips were the point. The context was incidental. This shift from television to clip production is one of the most specific and most damaging consequences of the 2005 realignment of Family Guy's cultural position. The borrowed format, optimized for viral distribution, consumed the genuine creative investment that had made the early show worth watching. And by the time that consumption was complete, the show had become something that nobody would have designed if they had been thinking about quality rather than commercial. Viability, the specific moment in Family Guy's history that most clearly marks the transition from genuine creative investment to commercial momentum, is the death and revival of Brian. Griffin in Season 12. This two-episode sequence, Brian hit by a car and killed in the episode Life of Brian, then revived by Stewie's time travel 2 episodes later in Christmas Guy, is the show at its most nakedly commercial. The death generated enormous media attention. It trended on social media for days. It made national news. It succeeded from a purely commercial standpoint, beyond almost anything the show had done in years, and it was undone within a month. The undoing is the key. The death could have been a genuine creative moment, the show finally committing to a permanent consequence, the show willing to live with a choice it had made, the show doing something irreversible that forced a genuine creative reckoning. Instead, the undoing announced, for anyone paying attention, that the death had never been a genuine creative choice. It had been a commercial strategy dressed as a creative choice. The show generated the rating spike it was looking for, and then returned to the status quo. Nothing changed. Nothing was learned. The borrowed character resumed performing the borrowed archetype he had been performing before his death. Fans who had been genuinely moved by Brian's death, who had allowed themselves to invest in the character's loss in the genuine way that good television can make you invest, reported feeling specifically betrayed by the revival. Not disappointed. Betrayed, because betrayal is the feeling that follows when you discover you were manipulated into investing by something that was not genuinely invested itself. The show asked you to feel something real about a fictional character, and then revealed that it was not willing to live with the fictional consequences of what it had done. It wanted the feeling from you without paying the creative price for generating it. This specific dynamic, asking the audience to invest while being unwilling to invest in return, is the concentrated expression of the show's later creative philosophy. The borrowed foundation generates enough recognition and comfort that audiences will continue to invest emotionally in the characters. The commercial machine generates enough surface-level novelty, enough shocking moments and viral clips to keep that investment alive. But when the audience's genuine emotional investment collides with a creative reality that has nothing genuine behind it, the collision produces exactly the feeling of betrayal that the Brian death and revival generated. The early Family Guy never produced this feeling because the early Family Guy was genuinely invested in its characters. The genuine investment was what made the borrowed foundations worth using. The warmth and specificity layered over the borrowed bones were the show's way of reciprocating the audience's emotional investment. When the genuine investment withdrew and only the commercial machine remained, the reciprocity stopped. The audience was still asked to invest. Nothing genuine was offered in return. The relationship between the show and its audience became extractive rather than mutual, and audiences, even when they cannot articulate why, can feel the difference. This is the final and most personal dimension of the originality question that we have been working through tonight. The borrowed foundations of Family Guy were not, in themselves, a problem for the audience's relationship with the show. Audiences do not typically know or care about the history of the templates their favorite shows deploy. What audiences respond to is genuine investment. The feeling that the people making the show care about the same things they care about. That the show is being made with the same authentic human energy that the audience is bringing to watching it. The early Family Guy had this quality. The later Family Guy progressively lost it, and the loss of it was directly connected to the removal of the genuine additions that had distinguished this specific version of the borrowed template from all the other versions. Family Guy was never original. But in its best years, it was genuine. And genuine is worth considerably more than original. The borrowed bones were everywhere. The genuine flesh was the show's. When the flesh was gone, the bones showed, and borrowed bones, performing without the flesh that once covered them, are not worth staying up for. The conversation about Family Guy's originality cannot be complete without spending specific time on something that tends to get lost in the broader structural analysis: the show's musical ambitions and how they fit the same pattern of borrowed foundations and genuine additions we have been tracing throughout this conversation. Seth MacFarlane is, among his other qualities, a genuinely accomplished singer in the big band and jazz standards tradition. He has recorded multiple albums of material in this style and performed it in venues ranging from television specials to Carnegie Hall. This musical sensibility, deeply rooted in the American popular song tradition of the 1940s and 1950s, permeates the show in specific and sometimes beautiful ways. The original songs written for Family Guy across its run are not throwaway comedy numbers. They are often well-crafted, genuinely funny, and occasionally genuinely moving pieces of music that demonstrate MacFarlane's deep familiarity with the specific forms and conventions of the American popular song. This is borrowed too. The forms and conventions he works in were developed by Cole Porter and Hoagy Carmichael and Sammy Cahn and dozens of other mid-century American songwriters, but borrowed in the way that any musician working in a tradition borrows from that tradition. The songs in Family Guy, at their best, represent MacFarlane's most personal and most clearly his own contribution to the show, because they come from a specific and deeply felt cultural knowledge that informs everything about how they are constructed. The music is where the borrowing and the genuine are most clearly synthesized into something that feels wholly original, even though it is working in an entirely established form. The tragedy of the show's later seasons includes the decreasing presence and quality of these musical moments as the show's overall creative investment declined. The early seasons produced memorable, well-crafted musical sequences that demonstrated the full range of MacFarlane's musical talent. The later seasons produced musical moments that were more perfunctory, more obviously functional, less clearly animated by genuine creative care. The music followed the same arc as everything else. The genuine personal investment withdrew from it too. There is also a specific element of Family Guy's visual and animation history that is relevant to the originality question, and that is rarely discussed in the context of the show's creative borrowings. The show's distinctive visual style, the specific way characters are drawn, the specific quality of the animation, the particular aesthetic choices that make Family Guy look the way it does, is itself borrowed from The Simpsons in a fairly direct way. Both shows share a visual vocabulary. The way the characters are constructed, the proportions, the simplified facial expressions, the specific relationship between character design and background design follows conventions established in The Simpsons animation. Both shows use a similar range of visual comedy techniques. The reaction shot, the double take, the physical comedy beat. Both share a palette and a visual density that are more similar to each other than either is to contemporaries like South Park, with its deliberately crude construction, or King of the Hill with its more realistically proportioned character design. Family Guy's animation has its own specific qualities that distinguish it from The Simpsons. The show was always somewhat slicker and more movement-oriented in certain respects, particularly in its action sequences and its physical comedy, but the foundational visual vocabulary was borrowed from the same tradition. And the specific conventions of the Simpsons' inflected prime-time animated sitcom aesthetic were present from the beginning. What the show added to this borrowed visual vocabulary in its early seasons was an expressiveness in the characters that was specific and well executed. The specific way Peter moves, the specific quality of his facial expressions, the specific visual grammar of Stewie's tiny villain physicality, these were worked out with care and executed consistently in the early seasons. The animation gave the character specific visual personalities that went beyond the borrowed conventions they were built on. In the later seasons, as the production became more mechanized and the creative investment in individual episode quality declined, The visual performances of the characters became more generic and less specifically themselves. The borrowed visual vocabulary remained. The specific, genuine visual personality that had distinguished these characters was gradually reduced. The question of what the audience owed to Family Guy, and what Family Guy owed its audience, is one that the show's history raises specifically and uncomfortably. The audience that loved the early Family Guy made a kind of investment, emotional, attentional, loyal, in the characters and the world of the show. They came back week after week. They bought the DVD sets when the show was canceled. They watched the Adult Swim reruns. They pushed the ratings high enough that Fox decided to bring the show back. Without this investment, there would have been no 4th season, no 5th, no 25th. The audience's loyalty was the condition that made the show's continuation possible. What does a show owe its audience in return for this investment? The implicit promise of ongoing quality? The genuine creative engagement that made the early investment worthwhile? The continued presence of the specific qualities that generated the initial attachment? Family Guy, across its later seasons, defaulted on this implicit promise in ways that became progressively more visible. The characters the audience had invested in were progressively stripped of the specific genuine qualities that had generated the investment. The emotional warmth that had made the early show feel worth caring about was replaced by cruelty and nihilism. The specific human truth of early Brian and early Peter was replaced by borrowed archetypes performing the shape of their former selves. The audience continued to invest, partly out of habit, partly out of loyalty to the early season's genuine quality, partly because the borrowed format still occasionally produced clips worth watching. But what they were investing in was no longer the thing their original investment had been for. This dynamic, audiences investing in something that is trading on the reputation of something that no longer fully exists, is one of the specific ways that the creative decline of a long-running show damages the relationship between the show and its viewers. The viewers who discovered Family Guy in its early seasons and fell in love with its early characters deserve the acknowledgement that what they fell in love with was real and genuinely worth loving. The borrowed foundations were there, yes, but so were the genuine additions that made those foundations come alive. The early show was genuinely good in the ways that matter most. The viewers who discovered the show in its middle or later seasons through viral clips or streaming or casual channel surfing had a different experience. They encountered a show that was performing the shape of something without the substance that had once filled the shape. They may have found specific moments worth watching. The cutaway format still occasionally produced genuinely funny clips, but they were missing the context that made those moments feel like part of something larger and more meaningful. They were watching the borrowed skeleton without the flesh, and not knowing what the flesh had once looked like. Both of these experiences are real. Both of these relationships with the show are legitimate. The show is not one thing but many things across its 26-year history, and honest engagement with it requires holding those different versions simultaneously. The brilliant early version, the good but declining middle version, the hollow but commercially durable later version, and understanding how each one relates to the others and to the borrowed foundations that underlie all of them. Family Guy was never fully original. In its best seasons, it was something genuine and specific and human and funny in ways that the borrowed foundations alone did not produce and could not produce. The genuine qualities were the show's actual contribution to the tradition it borrowed from. Their loss was the show's actual failure, not a failure of commercial viability, which remained intact, but a failure of creative honesty. The failure to keep investing genuine human truth in the work long enough to sustain the audience's trust. That is the honest reckoning. The show earned genuine love in its early years because it did something genuinely worth loving. It lost that love in its later years because it stopped doing the thing that had earned it. The borrowed bones are still there. The flesh is gone. The show continues. But the thing that mattered never came from the bones. The comparison between Family Guy and South Park is one that rewards more careful examination than it usually receives, because the two shows represent fundamentally different approaches to the question of how a long-running adult animated comedy should relate to its own borrowed foundations. South Park, created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, premiered in 1997 and has been in continuous production since then, making it one of the longest-running adult animated. Comedies in American television history. Like Family Guy, it borrows heavily from established traditions. The Four Boys in a Small Town format has predecessors, the specific satirical approach, taking current events and social phenomena and running them through a comedic filter that makes them absurd in ways that expose their actual absurdity. Is a long tradition in comedy going back to Jonathan Swift and before. South Park is not working in a vacuum. It is working in a tradition, but what South Park added to its borrowed foundations was something that Family Guy never quite managed. Genuine topicality with genuine consequence. South Park's willingness to address specific current events in the episodes produced within days of those events happening is a genuine creative commitment that has no equivalent in Family Guy's production model. An episode addressing a specific news story that aired 1 week after the story broke has a relationship to genuine reality that no other format in animated comedy can provide. This topicality required a production model that Parker and Stone developed specifically for South Park, a 6-day production timeline that allowed them to produce finished episodes faster than any other animated show in television history. The 6-day timeline is a genuine creative innovation, regardless of whether the satirical targets it serves are themselves original. Parker and Stone developed a production method that had no predecessor in animated television. They built it specifically to serve a creative commitment, addressing current events while those events are still current, that required capabilities the industry had never needed to develop before. The innovation is structural and procedural rather than thematic, but structural and procedural innovations can be as creatively significant as thematic ones. The method enabled a kind of comedy that had not been possible before it was developed. Family Guy's production model was borrowed in the same way its content was borrowed, following the conventions of prime-time animated sitcom production that The Simpsons had established. Multi-month production timelines. Episodes conceived and produced far in advance of their broadcast dates. A format that was not designed for topicality and that did not attempt to develop the specific capabilities topicality would require. This was a reasonable choice for a show whose creative ambitions did not include the specific kind of contemporary commentary that South Park's format enabled. But it was a borrowed choice, following an established model rather than developing something new. The difference in trajectory between the two shows, South Park maintaining and in many ways increasing its creative relevance across more than 25 years while Family Guy declined, is not unrelated to this fundamental difference in creative ambition. South Park was genuinely trying to do something specific and difficult with each episode. Family Guy was deploying borrowed format in pursuit of the best execution of borrowed conventions. When the execution deteriorated, Family Guy had nothing else to fall back on. When South Park has episodes that do not quite work, the genuine creative ambition sustains the show's relevance because the ambition itself is worth something. The willingness to try something specific and difficult, even when it does not fully succeed, maintains a relationship with the audience that pure execution of borrowed Conventions cannot replicate when the execution declines. This is another dimension of the same lesson the American Dad comparison teaches. Genuine creative ambition, the kind that develops new capabilities and attempts genuinely difficult things, provides resources that borrowed execution cannot. When a show with genuine creative ambition goes through a difficult period, the ambition is still there to sustain it. When a show without genuine creative ambition goes through a difficult period, the borrowed conventions are all that remain, and borrowed conventions cannot sustain a show on their own. The final thing worth saying about Family Guy's legacy as we reach the end of this long conversation is about the specific audience for whom the show still matters most. The people who were teenagers or young adults when the early seasons aired, who grew up with the show, who had the specific experience of discovering it in its genuinely good years, and following it through its decline. For these people, and there are many millions of them, Family Guy is not primarily a question of borrowing or originality. It is a part of their own history. The show was present during specific periods of their lives, was watched in specific places with specific people, became part of the texture of a time that is now past. The show is associated with feelings and memories that have nothing to do with creative questions of any kind, and those associations are real and legitimate and should not be dismissed or complicated away. For these people, the honest examination we have been conducting tonight is not meant to diminish what the show meant to them, or what the early seasons genuinely achieved. It is meant to explain something they may have already felt intuitively: that the show changed in specific ways and for specific reasons, that the change was not inevitable and was not simply the result of time, and that what they loved about the early seasons was real and worth loving even if it was assembled from borrowed materials. The genuine additions were real. The warmth was real. The specific human truth of the early characters was real. These things were genuinely present in the early Family Guy in ways that could not be fully explained by the borrowed foundations underneath them. And they are genuinely absent in the later Family Guy in ways that also cannot be explained by the borrowed foundations alone. Because the borrowed foundations are still there and still functioning, but the thing that made them worth watching has been removed. That removal is the sadness at the center of this story. Not the borrowing was fine. The borrowing was standard. The borrowing was how television has always worked. The sadness is in the removing, in the specific choices that stripped away the genuine additions one by one across 20-plus seasons, until what remained was the borrowed skeleton performing a version of what it once contained. The early Family Guy was never fully original. But it was genuinely itself. It was a specific and human and funny thing that existed at a specific moment and connected with millions of people in ways that mattered to them. That is worth more than originality. That is worth everything. And the most honest thing we can say about it, at the end of a long night, is that it was real while it lasted. The borrowed bones were there from the beginning, but for a few years they were alive. There is a dimension of this whole conversation that connects to something broader than Family Guy specifically, something about the nature of creative inheritance and what it asks of the people who receive it. Every creative tradition passes forward a set of tools, a set of conventions, a set of structural possibilities that were developed through the hard work of earlier practitioners. When a new practitioner picks up those tools, they inherit both the tools themselves and a kind of obligation, not a legal obligation, not a formal one, but a creative obligation to use those tools in ways that add something to the tradition rather than simply extracting from it. MacFarlane was a recipient of multiple traditions. the dysfunctional American family comedy going back to the 1950s, the cutaway and non-sequitur comedy going back to Monty Python and Laugh-In and vaudeville, the talking animal tradition going back to Aesop, the primetime animated comedy as refined by The Simpsons. He received all of these traditions simultaneously and assembled them into something that, at its best, repaid the inheritance. The genuine additions, the original Stewie concept, the specific interiority of early Brian, the warmth of the early family, were real creative contributions to the traditions he had borrowed from. The traditions were enriched by what he added to them. The later seasons represent a failure of this creative obligation. The traditions were borrowed from without being contributed to. The borrowed tools were used to produce content without the genuine additions that would have made the borrowing worthwhile. The obligation was defaulted on. And the traditions are no worse for it. They have other practitioners, other inheritors, other people doing the work of genuine contribution. But the show that defaulted on its obligation is worse for it. And the audience that had invested in the show's genuine phase is worse for it. And the art of adult animated television comedy is slightly worse for. The wasted opportunity of a show that could have sustained its genuine qualities and chose instead to coast on its borrowed ones. The waste is the real sadness. Not the borrowing, which was fine, the waste of the genuine qualities that the borrowed framework had been made to carry. Stewie, the evil genius. Brian, the specifically honest failure. The warm Griffin family. These were real creative contributions that deserved more than they got. They deserved to be sustained and developed and allowed to evolve genuinely across the show's full run. Instead, they were progressively dismantled in service of a commercial strategy that could not see the difference between the borrowed bones and the genuine flesh. The bones are still there. The flesh is gone. And when you know what the flesh was, when you have seen it, when you understand where it came from, and what made it genuinely new within the tradition it was built on, you cannot look at what remains and not feel the absence. Not as a fan complaint, as a genuine artistic loss. The specific creative contribution that the early Family Guy made to the traditions it borrowed from deserved better than what happened to it. The traditions will continue. Other shows will borrow from them. Some of those shows will add genuine things to what they borrow, as the early Family Guy added genuine things. The conversation about what genuine creative addition looks like, and what borrowed without addition looks like, and why the difference matters, is a conversation that will continue as long as people make things and other people watch them and care about what they are watching. Family Guy is one chapter of that conversation. A complicated chapter. A chapter that contains genuine brilliance and genuine failure, and the specific sadness of brilliance that was not protected from the failure that followed it. A chapter worth reading carefully, which is what we have been doing tonight. The room is very quiet now. You have been here for a while, and the thinking has settled into something like stillness. This is the state that long, careful conversations are designed to produce. Not the agitated stillness of a mind that has stopped thinking, but the quieter, more spacious stillness of a mind that has thought something through and arrived somewhere. What we arrived at tonight is this. Family Guy was never original in its structural foundations. The family template, the comedy format, the character archetypes, the visual vocabulary, all borrowed, all traceable, all clearly visible once you know what you are looking at. The show did not arrive from nowhere. It arrived from everywhere that had come before it, assembled with skill and genuine affection by a person who had been living with the borrowed materials for years before the public ever saw them. And it was genuinely good. In its early seasons, before the genuine editions were removed and only the borrowed skeleton remained, Family Guy was genuinely good television. It made millions of people laugh in ways that meant something. It gave those people characters they could care about and a world that felt specific and alive. The borrowed bones were there from the very beginning, but the flesh that covered them was real. The most honest and most useful thing we can say about the show, after all the careful examination, is this: it was borrowed and it was genuine, simultaneously. The borrowing did not cancel the genuineness. The genuineness did not cancel the borrowing. Both things were true at once. And they were true in ways that had specific practical consequences for the show's history. The genuineness was what made the early seasons worth watching. The loss of the genuineness was what made the later seasons feel like something had gone wrong. The borrowed skeleton was always there underneath, but the borrowed skeleton alone was never enough. Understanding both things simultaneously, holding the borrowed and the genuine together without letting either one dissolve into the other, is what this conversation has been trying to build toward. Not a verdict, not a ranking, not a determination of whether Family Guy was good or bad or worth watching or not worth watching. Just an honest picture of what it actually was and where it actually came from, and what that means for how we understand both its achievements and its failures. The achievements were real. The failures were chosen. The borrowed foundations were the raw material for both. What was done with those foundations, in the years when something genuine was being built on top of them, and in the years when the genuine thing was being slowly dismantled, is the actual story of the show. And that story, honestly told, is more interesting and more useful than the simpler stories about whether Family Guy was original or whether it was good or whether it deserved. Its fate. It was borrowed. It was genuine. It let the genuine go. The bones are still performing. But the bones were never the point. Sleep well. The thinking is done. If you are still here, or if you woke up and are reading this in the first light of morning, I want to say something directly before we go. This channel exists because of conversations like this one. The long ones. The ones that move slowly through complicated subjects without hurrying toward a conclusion. The ones that treat you as someone capable of holding complexity without needing it resolved into simple verdicts. The ones that use the quiet and the dark and the particular quality of attention that late night makes available to go somewhere that daytime conversations rarely reach. Family Guy is a strange subject for a conversation like this, and I know that. It is not the most serious subject. It is a cartoon about a family in a fictional Rhode Island city where a baby used to try to kill his mother and a dog has a graduate school education. The stakes of understanding it accurately are not high in any cosmic sense. Nobody's life depends on knowing where the cutaway gag format actually came from, but caring about things carefully, including things that do not require careful caring, including cartoons and comedy shows and the specific history of borrowed creative. Foundations in primetime television is its own practice. It is a habit of attention that extends beyond the specific subject to which it is applied. The way you watch a Family Guy episode can tell you something about how you watch everything. The way you think about where creative work comes from, what it owes to its sources, what it adds that its sources did not have, what happens when the genuine additions are removed. These ways of thinking are useful everywhere creativity exists and creative choices are made, which is nearly everywhere human beings do anything worth paying attention to. So thank you for paying attention tonight to the subject. which is genuinely interesting if you look at it carefully. And to the practice of looking at things carefully, which is worth maintaining wherever you can. Hit subscribe if you want to continue this kind of conversation. Drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is if you have not already. And I will see you in the next one. Good night.